I'm Dr. Cyan Proctor, and I'm an analog astronaut.
I'm Jeffrey Notkin, President of the National Space Society, and this is
A Day in Space.
Well, Cyan, you lead an adventurous and exciting life. I would like you to share some of the details of your life experience with our viewers around the world.
Well, I basically have space in my blood, I think, because I remember at an early age just looking up and just dreaming about going out there and exploring. And so I wanted to become a pilot, wanted to be an astronaut, all of these things. And it just so happens that in 2009, I applied for the NASA astronaut selection process, and I was a finalist. So I got down to a yes-no phone call. And even though it was a no, I became an analog astronaut over the last 10 years.
One of the things that really amazes me is that you tell this story about not quite being selected as an astronaut with such delight. I think a lesser person would have been crushed. But you've taken it, you've used it as a springboard to go into other things.
Well, what I realized is that there are opportunities, and there are opportunities here on Earth. And becoming an analog astronaut has enabled me to help advance human spaceflight, but here, just on Earth, doing things like living in Moon and Mars simulations.
Tell us about this, if you would. I'm really intrigued by this red, vaguely honey beehive-like prop that we have here. This is related to your analog astronaut work.
That's correct. An analog astronaut is somebody who engages in human spaceflight training and research, but here on Earth. And so, in other words, Jeff, I like to live in Moon and Mars simulations all over the world.
And you like to eat well too, if I'm not mistaken. You're not only a chef, but you're also an author of a rather unusual cooking book.
That's right. It's called Meals for Mars, and it's based on me living in the high seas habitat, this is a 3D model of that. And I lived in this habitat for 4 months, doing a food study for NASA. It was to investigate food strategies for long-duration spaceflight, so if we were going to Mars.
So 4 months in a plastic tub and you're still smiling.
That's correct, because they were feeding me.
And the director of the High Seas Project, if I'm not mistaken, is Hank Rogers, who sits on our board of governors of the National Space Society. Colleague of yours?
That is correct. Hank Rogers owns the high seas habitat.
Excellent.
And so what about you, Jeff? What about your background?
Well, Cyan, you know me, a bit of a rascal, bit of spaceflight, bit of rock and roll, bit of filmmaking. So in addition to serving as president for the National Space Society, I am on the board of governors of the NSS. I am on the board of directors of the Astrosociology Research Institute, and I'm a science writer, a television host, perhaps best known for TV's Meteorite Men and also the multidisciplinary science show STEM Journals. And in my spare time, I'm a movie producer, and I do both documentaries like First to the Moon, which is the official documentary story of the Apollo 8 mission, and the feature film Revenge of Zoe, which is set in the world of comic books, which was filmed in Tucson. And I like to mix my interests, but somehow it always seems to come back to spaceflight, comics, science fiction, meteorites, bit of history, bit of arts, that kind of thing.
Just a little bit of everything.
Yeah. We here, and probably ourselves, have spoken about the multiple arguments for going into space. And there's the obvious, which is, well, we humans are explorers and we have a need to get to the top of the hill and see what's on the other side. And then there's the survival argument, which is we all appreciate that at some point in the distant future, there will be no more Earth. And so we do have to establish other living opportunities off-world. But there's a more nuts and bolts and more relevant and concrete argument for the day-to-day world. For that person who says, well, I don't understand why we're spending all this money on spaceflight when we still have problems at home. And the argument, the reasoning that we need to convey to that person is that every dollar that's invested in space development, in space technology, gets repaid back here on Earth to an enormous degree. Perhaps as high as 15 to 1 is one of the estimates. How do you feel about that? Is that a valid argument, a valid reason?
It absolutely is. I mean, we have real challenges here on Earth, and the way we're going to solve them is through some of the technologies that we create and advance in space. And so we just don't see it because it's just one of those little disconnects. But the more we talk about how things like Velcro came from space, the space program, and it's everywhere.
Yeah, we're probably using it at the moment, actually. What would you most like to see? What's your dream thing? Is it a specific technological development? Is it a more people-oriented thing?
You know, for me, I think that the big thing is about crew cohesion and how we can get along better. Because if we can figure out how to do it in a small, like, space shuttle or the International Space Shuttle, or in a habitat on the moon or Mars, then maybe we could do it on Starship Earth.
No, that's a good argument and a good hope. For me, I think it's arts-based, which might sound surprising since I'm a science guy, but I'm also an artist, and I'm fascinated by the idea that all of these photographs, all of the footage that we've seen of Earth, of the missions, that's all been taken, all of the off-Earth footage has been taken by astronauts who are very highly trained and very highly skilled in other areas. And yet, they managed to take these magnificent images. Show me a person who has technology that isn't familiar with the Earthrise photo from the Apollo 8 mission. We all know it. It's like the Mona Lisa of the science world. And yet that photo and all the other beautiful photos of Earth, those marvelous images from the International Space Station, from Skylab, they were taken by astronauts in spare moments, in between their assigned tasks. So what will it be like when we send professional, experienced artists into space to share what they see and what they feel with the world at large? What will it be like when we have a great writer go into space to record the experience, or a photographer, a painter, a composer, or filmmakers? That's what I want to see.
It'll be amazing. The inspiration that will come from that. I mean, science and the imagination. To me, there's nothing better than that. And when we're talking about inspiring the next generation to be explorers and to want to go onto the moon and Mars and beyond, it's going to take those kinds of people with the imagination and technical know-how to inspire us in those ways.
I'm so glad you said that, because describing a person with imagination and the technical know-how is a perfect introduction to our first guest. So I would like to introduce all of you to Bruce Pittman, my friend and colleague. He is the Senior Operating Officer of the National Space Society, so someone I have the privilege of working with on a regular basis. And he is also the Director of Space Development at Offworld, which means he's working on the space portal at NASA Ames. Pretty exciting stuff. And he is a recipient of NASA's Exceptional Public Service Medal. So, ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to meet Bruce Pittman.
Hello, my name is Bruce Pittman, and I'm the Senior Vice President and Senior Operating Officer of the National Space Society. And on behalf of the entire leadership team of the NSS, I'd like to welcome you to our exciting virtual event, A Day in Space. To help you get the most from this event, I'm going to give you some background information on the space program, a little bit of past, present, and future, as well as some background on the National Space Society. If you're already a member, we're glad you could join us. If you're not a member, we're glad you found us and that you could join us today to participate. A Day in Space will honor past space achievements, what's gone on in the past, what's happening today, and there's some really exciting things going on, and then what's just around the corner that we think will delight and amaze you. So the National Space Society was actually born from two predecessor organizations. I'd like to give you a little bit of history because it gives you a better perspective on the organization today. Dr. Wernher von Braun, who was the father of the Saturn V rocket and the former director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, founded the National Space Institute in 1974, shortly after he retired from NASA. The National Space Institute was focused on educating the public about the benefits of space. The other organization was the L5 Society that was founded in 1975, and this organization was inspired by the work of a Princeton physics professor named Gerard K. O'Neill regarding space colonies. His idea was that it was possible to have thousands of people living and working in permanent habitations beyond the Earth. And then finally, the National Space Society was formed in 1987 with the merger of these two organizations. Now, if you look at the foundation from Dr. O'Neill's work, you'll see that he was inspired by the Apollo 11 program and the landing on the moon in 1969. So he decided to make use of the excitement around the Apollo program to provide homework assignments for his freshman's physics class. And so we started having them do a number of homework exercises regarding living in space. He didn't really take this too seriously at the time, but when he started getting the responses back, and especially some of their longer reports and analyses, he got really both excited and inspired by what his students had come up with. And so he started doing his own research. And in 1974, he was able to get his first peer-reviewed paper published in Physics Today, and it was entitled "The Colonization of Space." The next year, NASA helped with the funding for a 10-week summer study on space settlement that Dr. O'Neill led, that was hosted at the NASA Ames Research Center in Silicon Valley and at Stanford University. This summer study consisted of 19 faculty members from universities all across the country, 6 graduate students, and a number of NASA advisors. One of those participants, faculty members, was one of my undergraduate professors, Dr. Mont Hubbard from UC Davis. And the following year, when I was a senior at Davis, Dr. Hubbard explained what had happened in the summer study, and I got quite excited about that. So that was my first encounter with the space settlement concepts. So some of the key results of the studies were that while it was doable, 1, it would be expensive, and 2, it would be very challenging. And so some of the key elements that were required to pull this off was, 1, that you needed a fully reusable launch vehicle to get the cost of going to space down to a more reasonable level. That number 2, you needed to get most of the mass, most of the material that you would need for a space colony from the moon or the asteroids, because bringing everything up from the Earth, even with a fully reusable vehicle, would be too expensive. And finally, you needed an economic engine for what those people would do in space. And what Dr. O'Neill came up with was to leverage off of work that had been done by Dr. Peter Glaser a few years before, and the idea of space solar power satellites, where you would have the colonists construct these large, huge, actually, space solar power satellites, again constructed mostly from material that was harvested from the moon, and then they would assemble these power stations and then beam the power to the Earth and sell it into the terrestrial grid, and this would be the economic engine for the space colonies. So NASA published a special publication on this report of the work that was done during the summer study, but not satisfied with this, Dr. O'Neill wrote his own book aimed at the general public called The High Frontier, Human Colonies in Space, which was published in 1976. O'Neill then worked very hard to spread the word about this. He was on the Johnny Carson show, the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and he wrote articles for Omni Magazine and other popular periodicals to get the word out. So, taking the theme of both of the organizations, both of the benefits of space and people living and working in space, the National Space Society adopted a vision, and the vision is simple and to the point. It's people living and working in thriving communities beyond the Earth and using the vast resources of space for the dramatic betterment of humanity. So you can see the blending of the two organizations, the National Space Institute and the L5 Society, into the vision for the NSS. So what does the NSS do today? So we are a grassroots, not-for-profit space education and advocacy organization. We have dozens of chapters around the country and around the world. We have a number of educational programs that are geared for both high school and college-age students that are designed to inspire and nurture the next generation of space technologists, entrepreneurs, and leaders. We write a number of white papers and position papers on a variety of topics every year, and all of these are available on our website at nss.org. We hold two major conferences every year. The International Space Development Conference is held in May, and the Space Settlement Summit is held in the fall. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic this year, we were not able to hold our International Space Development Conference, but hopefully next year, if things get better, we'll be able to hold that, and we hope you can join us next May in Los Angeles. At these conferences, we give out a number of major awards. We are also getting more into social media, and so we are now have a social media campaign on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and we hope you will follow us on these mediums. So as far as developing the next generation of space leaders goes, we think we've got a fairly good track record. Let me give you a few examples. Lori Garver was the second NSS Executive Director from 1987 to 1996. She was our longest serving executive director, and she went on to become the deputy administrator of NASA from 2009 to 2013. George Whiteside was the NSS director from 2004 to 2008, and he is today the CEO of Virgin Galactic, working for Sir Richard Branson. And finally, Scott Pace was the NSS Executive Vice President in the 1990s, and now he is the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council that is chaired by Vice President Mike Pence. So what does the NSS advocate? So some of the things that we've supported over the years and we continue to support is the International Space Station and the transition to whatever comes after, and that transition be seamless, that reducing the cost of getting to space and expanding the access to space for more and more people is one of our goals. Protecting the Earth from asteroids and cometary collisions and making space travel safer, worrying about issues such as orbital debris and space traffic management and regulations regarding access to space. Returning to the moon and traveling onto Mars have long been goals of the National Space Society. Building a thriving space economy both in LEO and in deep space, which includes mining the moon and the asteroids, we think is an essential part of a sustainable space development program. And finally, accelerating space development infrastructure in particular, and the use of public-private partnerships to help finance that. I'm going to talk more about public-private partnerships in a minute. And then finally, training the next generation and encouraging students to be interested in STEAM. Yes, there is room for the arts in space. We have an award-winning magazine, so if you're interested in any of these topics and want to know, we have published a number of articles over the years on a number of these topics. So what about this LEO economy? So as most of you know, we have an International Space Station that's been in orbit for over 20 years and permanently occupied in low Earth orbit. In 2005, Congress established the ISS National Lab, which gave half of the pressurized volume and half of the resources of the U.S. portion of the International Space Station as a national laboratory that NASA would run, but that would be there for the benefit of non-NASA users, both in the federal government as well as the general community. NASA has set up a number of public-private partnerships with a variety of commercial companies, a few of which are Made in Space, NanoRacks, Space Tango, TechShots, and Bioserve. And some of the areas that they're exploring in space are additive manufacturing in microgravity. In particular, semiconductor and exotic glasses are some of the really exciting research areas. A lot of work being done in biotechnology and drug development and drug delivery, in regenerative medicine, including replacement organs such as heart, lung, kidneys, and even retinas for curing blindness. Food production and remote sensing are also some areas that are being researched on the International Space Station. As of last year, NASA has come up with a new commercialization policy that now makes it much easier for private individuals and companies to make use of the space station, even to the point of hosting non-NASA astronauts on the USS portion of the space station. So one company, Axiom Space, has now signed an agreement with NASA to fly 3 passengers to the International Space Station at the end of next year. And Tom Cruise has announced that he's working with both Axiom and NASA, and he's going to be shooting a movie on the International Space Station. So the space paradigm is shifting. The rules of space and some exciting new players are into the game. And I wanted to just give you 2 examples here, people that you've probably heard of but may not know the details of what they're doing as far as space is concerned. The first is Elon Musk, who founded SpaceX in 2002 to make humanity a multiplanetary species. Over the last 18 years, I think it's fair to say that SpaceX has revolutionized how rockets and spacecraft are built. He's developed the partially reusable Falcon 9 rocket, which is now the most reliable and most frequently flown rocket that's currently flying in space, as well as the Dragon capsule has carried cargo to the International Space Station, and now has also, for the first time, carried crew. So in late May, the new Dragon capsule, the Dragon 2, delivered 2 NASA astronauts to the International Space Station, and they will be up there for the next 60 days, coming back in early August, and then the next crew will go up probably in late August or in September. So the Dragon and the Falcon 9 development was done as part of a public-private partnership between NASA and SpaceX. So the government paid a good portion of this, but SpaceX paid for part of this as well. And so as part of that deal, they were able to streamline the amount of oversight that NASA would do and give SpaceX some more design flexibility about how they built and operated the vehicles, but all within NASA safety guidelines. But they also, SpaceX owns and operates these vehicles. They are not owned by NASA. So now SpaceX can offer these vehicles to other non-NASA sources, and NASA is encouraging them to do that. And so that's where the Axiom is going to fly the astronauts, as well as other people that are now signing up to make use of these capabilities. So not satisfied with this, Elon is now set up for a new generation of launch vehicles called the Starship. Now this will be a fully reusable, with both the first and the second stages being able to come back and land on Earth and be frequently flown and with fast turnaround. So these will be truly huge vehicles, where the Saturn V rocket that Dr. von Braun built was 363 feet tall and had 7.5 million pounds of thrust. The Starship that Elon is building will be even larger and will have twice the thrust that the Saturn V did, over 15 million pounds of thrust. It will be capable of carrying hundreds of people to low Earth orbit, or 100 to 150 tons of payload. He already has a paying customer who is signed up to fly the Starship around the moon in 2023, and NASA recently awarded SpaceX a contract to develop the Starship for landing on the moon as early as 2024. So the other person I wanted to talk about was Jeff Bezos and his company Blue Origin. Jeff was only 5 years old when the Apollo 11 landed on the moon, but he says he remembers it clearly sitting in his family's living room watching the television. In high school, Bezos read O'Neill's book, The High Frontier. He says he read it several times, and this inspired him in his graduating valedictorian talk from high school to talk about millions of people living and working in space. When he graduated from Princeton in 1986, he ended up on Wall Street in the early 90s, and he was very successful there. He was the senior vice president of a hedge fund in New York, but he gave it all up because he realized if he wanted his vision of space to come true, he needed to make some really big money, more than you could make even at a hedge fund. And so he quit his job there, and he got in the car, drove to Washington State, and founded Amazon. The rest is history. He is now the richest man in the world, and he admits that it was because of the influence of reading The High Frontier and the dream of having millions and now billions of people living and working in space that has truly inspired him. Bezos is now selling $1 billion a year of Amazon stock to fund Blue Origin, but he does hope that endeavor will make money. He has set up a suborbital launch facility in West Texas, where he flies his suborbital New Shepard vehicle, which he has flown over a dozen times, and they plan to start flying paying passengers in the near future. Bezos has orbital aspirations. He has set up a 750,000 foot production facility at the Kennedy Space Center to build his next generation of orbital launch vehicles. His New Glenn vehicle, which will be a heavy lift launch vehicle, be capable of launching 45,000 pounds of payload to low Earth orbit, and again will be able to recover the first stage of that vehicle, landing on an offshore landing platform. He will be launching from Launch Complex 36 at the Kennedy Space Center by the end of next year. By the way, this was the launch pad that I launched the first mission that I was part of, Pioneer Venus, back in 1978. So it's kind of interesting to see him making use of my old launch pad. So Blue Origin has teamed up with Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, and they have also won an award from NASA to compete for delivering NASA astronauts to the lunar surface as part of the Human Landing System program that NASA has sped up. So what does all this add up to? So Musk's goal right now is to build a huge fleet of 1,000 starships over the next decade and use them to establish a city on Mars. He plans to send the first test crew there as early as 2025, and eventually by the end of the century, he would like to have 1, a thriving economy, and 2, 1 million people living on Mars. Jeff Bezos is building his New Glenn vehicle, as I said, and he has even larger aspirations than that. His vision is of the future is, again, millions or even billions of people living and working in space. He wants to move heavy industry off of the Earth and out into space, and then to be able to rezone the Earth as residential and light industrial, and to return the Earth to a more pristine state. So, speaking for all of the volunteers who have worked so hard to put together a day in space, we hope you enjoy it, and we welcome your feedback and support. If you are not already a member, we would encourage you to consider joining and participating with us in this exciting journey into the future. Enjoy.
Hola, my name is Dr. G Gonzalez, also known as Dr. G. I'm a molecular geneticist, a researcher, and an educator here in Southern California. My goal is to inspire the future world changer in space exploration. With diversity, equity, and inclusion in the forefront, STEM innovation will have no bounds. Our future, together on this planet and beyond, will be a better place for all of us.
Thank you, Bruce. I feel that your message really helps clarify the goals of this entire Day in Space broadcast, which is to highlight the excitement and the importance and the meaning of spaceflight, past, present, and future. And so it is quite appropriate that we are going to commence with a look back at a part of space history that I think it would be fair, Cyan, to say it holds more than a passing interest for you. Would that be true? You're kind of an enthusiast when it comes to the Apollo program.
I love the Apollo program because I literally would not be here if it wasn't for this program.
Well, do elaborate. Do tell us the story, please. I gather there's one mission that's a bit of a standout for you.
It is. It is actually Apollo 11. And the reason why is because I have a personal family connection to Apollo 11. And so you don't know this, but my dad got his start in the space industry really early on. He actually started with ICBM missiles and tracking those. And the early rockets for space were built off of ICBM technology. And so when my dad was really young, he actually started working for NASA on Guam. And I have this, which is a commemoration of the Apollo 11. So 1966 to 1970, my family was on Guam. Have you been there?
Alas, no, it's actually one of the few places I've not been to, so let me put that on the to-do list.
Well, I was born on Guam.
How do you spell that?
Do you know why NASA had people on Guam?
No?
They had tracking stations all around the world because as you send a spacecraft around the Earth, there's no signal back to North America where we are, so you had to have tracking stations around the globe that were able to relay that message as the spacecraft passed over. And so my dad was on Guam working at the NASA tracking station, and for the Apollo 11 mission, I was born 8.5 months afterwards. So I'm a moon baby.
You were not kidding when you said that you had space in your blood. So you were literally fabricated during the Apollo era. You are a true child of Apollo. And you will appreciate this. I have visited 2 of the very remote tracking stations that were used in the Apollo missions. One was on Grand Turk in the Turks and Caicos Islands, and another is Parkes, the famous Australian observatory in the Australian outback.
I've been to Parkes.
Have you really?
I have.
Look, we just keep discovering all these things that we have in common. I did not know that about you.
My brother lives in Australia right now, hi Langley, and he actually helped celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Apollo mission in Australia there.
I bet he met my friend or knows my friend John Sarkisian, who is one of the operational scientists there, and gave me an amazing tour. And I must say, it's the only observatory I've ever been to where there were sheep running around in close proximity to the dish. That's fun-loving Australia for you.
And what people don't know is that after Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong actually went on tour around the world to thank everybody at the tracking stations. And my dad got to meet Neil Armstrong, and Neil Armstrong signed his autograph to my father. It says, "To Ed, thanks for all the help, Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11. My older brother Langley, who lives in Australia, has that. But I have this, which is the commemorative plaque, and it has my dad's name on it, Edward Langley Proctor Jr.
And doesn't that speak so admirably of Neil that he would take the time to travel around the world and thank people?
Oh, yeah.
That's a marvelous story. Well, you'll be very pleased to know that we have an exclusive interview with Neil's colleague, Buzz Aldrin, coming up very shortly. This is the first time this interview's ever aired. It's an exclusive sit-down that I did with him quite recently, talking about his extremely exciting life in space. And I suppose I have to own up and tell you my favorite Apollo mission. Although before I do that...
Can I guess?
Yeah, go ahead, you guess. Why don't you guess?
Well, I would say Apollo 11 because that's the one that most people would pick. But maybe Apollo 13?
Well, Apollo 13 would be a really good one, and we will be hearing from Fred Hayes very soon. And of course, we love the film. I have to say, my favorite Apollo mission is Apollo 9. And I'm a bit of a contrary guy. I never like to pick the obvious. So here's why. One of the most successful of any spaceflight missions. So many new technologies were tried out during that one, and particularly the first true untethered flight of the lunar module as piloted by Rusty Schweickart, a colleague who went on to found the B612 Foundation, a nonprofit that does very important work alerting we earthbound humans to the danger of asteroid collision. Mm-hmm. Well, so there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We've owned up to our favorite Apollo missions, and we have something both exciting and relevant coming up right now, don't we?
That's right. We have a panel of Apollo astronauts. We have Al Worden from Apollo 15.
Fred Hayes, Apollo 13.
Walt Cunningham from Apollo 7.
And Jerry Griffin, the NASA flight controller.
And what I love about this is that they're going to talk about the challenges of the Apollo program of going to the moon, not just once, but multiple times. And that's really relevant to right now because we are going back to the moon to put the first female footprints in the lunar regolith. And so we can learn from their challenges how to be successful here and now.
Right on. And about time too.
I'm just going to jump right in because we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time. So our topic today is innovation in the space race era and beyond. So in 1957, as many of you know, Sputnik was launched by the Soviet Union. It's their first satellite, little thing about the size of a basketball. Went into Earth orbit. All it did was beep and take some very rudimentary temperature measurements, but it scared the dickens out of the West, and people were just thinking, oh my God, the Russians are ahead of us. What are we going to do? You all remember this. It was a big moment, and the Western powers went nuts. And thus began the space race. NASA was formed shortly thereafter, had a mandate to get a satellite up very quickly, struggled to do that. We had a mandate to get humans in space very quickly. We struggled to do that a bit. The Soviet Union beat us to that. And as all this is going on, with a grand total of 15 minutes of suborbital flight time by Alan Shepard in the first Mercury mission, President Kennedy said, guys, we're going to the moon and we're going to do it by the end of the decade. Have at it. Now, this was not a great interest in science or exploration on his part. This was a geopolitical mandate to show the world that the United States and the Western powers were the leaders in technology, education, engineering, and science. Well, I think, and you would know this, there were probably a lot of slack jaws that afternoon when that announcement was made because we didn't really know how we were going to get there. Some things we didn't even know what we needed to know to start to how to get there. Questions in metallurgy, questions in rocket engine design. All this stuff was brand new. So innovation the word innovation doesn't even really begin to cover what we were talking about in this era. We had to invent this entire industry based on some very rudimentary knowledge inherited from the Germans in World War II and the earliest efforts in both the US and the Soviet Union for intercontinental ballistic missiles to invent the program that would let these gentlemen go to the moon. So I think my first question is, we have this post-World War II competition between the two superpowers. It's a non-shooting war to, quote, conquer the heavens, unquote. And Kennedy looking for some goal that we can actually beat the Russians at, because according to his advisors, it wasn't going to be a space station. They could do that first. It wasn't going to be looping the moon. They could probably do that first. But landing on the moon and coming safely home was complex enough that we had a good chance. And as it turned out, that worked out to be the case. We managed to do it. So I think if you look at that era and you look at Kennedy's speech, there were two of them, one to Congress and one to the public, and you really listen to what's being said, there's a number of things, and Tony writes about this quite a bit in his book and the articles he does in the magazine I edit. This program that he laid out to land on the moon by the end of the decade was a clear goal, it was a concise goal, it was bold and daring, it was competitive, which seems to be something that Americans like. It was well-funded, which is important, but perhaps most importantly, it was time-limited. So I'd like to ask you gentlemen, because you were there, all I do is write about it, you were there, what parts of these factors do you think were the most important that made this achievable in that period of time, and how can we relate that to what we're trying to do now? And why don't we start right here with Jerry?
A number of things happened that it was very fortunate. For one thing, in World War II, we built in this country a great aviation industry. And much of that aviation know-how was moved right into the space program. It had to go higher and faster and different materials. But we had a base of people that, for one thing, made it work. Now, Rod mentioned that when Kennedy said we're going to go to the moon, do it in this decade, I think there were a lot of people, I know I was one, that said, really? You think we could do that? And but we had another advantage in that we were primarily pretty young people. In fact, I was one of the oldest guys in the control center because I'd served 4 years of active duty in the Air Force. and I was 29, and I was one of the old guys. We had guys 22, 23, right out of college. We've been told to do this. We've been given the keys to the car, essentially, and told we could drive it. And we didn't know we couldn't do it, so we just set about to get it done. And we had support from both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat. We went through 3 presidents in that time, and the support never wavered. And that's what we've lost in a way we don't have now. We can't seem to get behind an issue like this one and make it happen. I've probably said enough. I'll let these other guys.
Yeah. I think you can track the ups and the downs and the successes and the failures in the space program based on who the leadership was in Washington. When JFK was probably the greatest booster and sponsor of the space program of any president we've had. But I think there's a lot more to him making that pronouncement than there was just a competition with the Russians. Back in the late 50s and early 60s, there was a lot of unrest in this country. We'd had the Bay of Pigs. We'd had a bunch of other things happen. And I think this was also an attempt on his part to bring the country together because it was a goal that everybody in the country understood and supported. And I think that was very important. But I think there's also a hidden component in all of that, which to me is the key to why the Apollo program was successful and why this country has been so successfully in the market since then, and that is the development of technology that it took to go to the moon, do it safely, and bring people back. We developed back in the late 50s and early 60s things called solid-state components, solid-state devices, and they were based on silicon chips that were developed back in the late 50s by the Defense Advanced Research Products Agency in this country. Those silicon chips now are in every cell phone, every MRI, every television, everything that we live with today involves the use of those kind of chips, and nobody else had them except in this country. And they were a big help in getting us to the moon and back. So to me, the development of technology in the program is almost as important as sending somebody to the moon. It's the technology to get you there that's important.
The only thing I'd add, at the time, career-wise, I was a test pilot for NASA. I was at Lewis Research Center, in Cleveland, and then I moved on to Edwards, where the X-15 program was going on. And so my only knowledge, if you will, or association anyway, with space was rocket engine testing that was being done at Lewis. And of course, the X-15 rocket ship was in play at Edwards. So I have to say, when they made that announcement, I just said, this is a big step. I mean, just like Al said, can we really pull this off? Because of course, I had no knowledge base at all of the space activities and even what had been done up to that time, starting with Mercury was just getting underway. So other than that, the thing mentioned, of course, is the alliance that we've had and support from the president on through. I thought the mission itself, the description of going to the moon, it was intriguing enough that we had, I call it probably the strongest grassroots support we've had in a space program since. People could relate to that, and it was pretty spectacular to think about. And I think that was another thing that also, if they took surveys and whatever with the Politico pay attention to, I think it was doing pretty good even in that time frame for the most part, to part of the program to get to the moon. So I think that helped as well to keep this assurance.
First, I would like to thank having such a nice crowd here of people that are enthusiastic about this. It's, at least for me, it's pretty rare. And I'd also like to give you a little bit of a different perspective on the Russians and them being ahead of us, if you will. And this may or may not be accepted by my friends who haven't heard me say this, but when we set out to go to even before we set out to go to the moon, when Alan Shepard got his flight, that was like a month after they had sent Yuri Gagarin up. And that Yuri Gagarin, it was up and around the world once. I guarantee you the Russians did not have control of that spacecraft. He's along for the ride. We had a different set of program going from the beginning. And as a matter of fact, since there was a delay between the Mercury program and the Apollo program, which was the program that was going to go to the moon, we filled that delay with the Gemini program. And that Gemini program was not all that expensive compared to Apollo. It was a fairly short term, but they, over a period of 2 years with 12 launches, they did EVA, rendezvous, docking, and they controlled the steering on the re-entry. So by the time we finished the Gemini program, which was before we got a chance to fly on Apollo, but they were getting Apollo started, we had cut out all of the things that we could possibly have thought of at the time as the Russians being ahead. So it's not a popular position today, but by the time we got to that point, technically, we had regained, and we're back, in my opinion, we're back in the first position for getting man into space and back.
I just want to make a little comment about how important Al Shepard's flight was. I was flying in a fighter squadron in Washington, D.C. out of Andrews Air Force Base, and all the pilots were kind of milling around the pilot's lounge, which is really our source of coffee back in those days. And we were watching a television, and it was counting down to Al Shepard making his launch, that very important first launch. All of a sudden, over the radio, we get a call from our aircraft maintenance officer who's up test flying one of our F-102s, and he's having a problem with it, and he's got to come back in and make an emergency landing, and he can't get the gear down. So he's going to have to land without the landing gear on his airplane at the same time that Al Shepard's getting ready to take off. So we had a choice to make. Did we sit there and watch Al Shepard go, or did we get our marshmallows and go to the runway for Major Stenger when he was going to land his airplane? And you obviously know which ones we did. Yeah. We collected our marshmallows.
Test pilots, you gotta love them. So just to shift direction a little tiny bit here, we're almost as far from that first moon landing now as that was from the first flight of the Wright brothers. In a few years, it'll be equidistant, which just blows my mind. There's commentary you can say about how much we've advanced since then. You know, was the space race, picking the low-hanging fruit and so forth. But my point here is, when I look back on what you guys are working with and what you accomplished, the further I get from that, the more it's almost hard to believe it ever happened, based on the technology you had at that time. It was remarkable, and as has been said by a number of people and re-quoted, it's almost as if they reached into the 21st century and brought Apollo back to the 1960s. So my question is, with that kind of innovation comes a certain amount of acceptance of risk. And I think that equation has changed over the years. I think NASA got very sensitized to risk reduction after the Challenger explosion and then Columbia. So, and there's a bigger discussion to be had about private spaceflight, but for now, let's just talk about NASA moving ahead. What is, in your opinions, having put your lives on the line, what is an acceptable level of risk to encourage rapid innovation and accomplishment in spaceflight?
Start with these guys.
You want me to start? Oh, okay.
One of the guys that sat on top of a rocket.
Thank you, Jerry.
With liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen under.
I think the level of risk that you will accept is dependent on the goal that you have. If I'm walking across the street, I don't want much risk. But if I'm going to the moon, I'm willing to accept almost any risk. I know, as far as my crew was concerned, we decided amongst ourselves before we ever left the launch pad that we would accept dying on the flight because what we were doing was more important than we were. Now, I think there's a whole series of of levels of goals and risk in between those two. So I think it's really a function of how important the goal is. On the other hand, I think we need to be rather logical in the goals that we establish. So what are our next goals going to be, and what is the level of risk that we're willing to take? I think Mars is a very risky thing. I think there's no question about it. It's going to be a 1.5-year flight, and a lot of things could happen in a 1.5 years. So I think the level of risk is going up proportionate to that goal, and that's just an intermediate goal. I mean, I don't want anybody to think that Mars is a destination. It's only another step on the way.
Now, I'd have to say the confidence I had, obviously with the possibility, as it turned out, things might not go right. You consider that I had a designee, Jerry Carr, that I had to my house before I flew, that Jerry knew where important papers were, and he was the guy that was going to take care of my wife should I not get back on that flight. And that was kind of customary. I don't know if, Walt, same way in Marine fighter squadrons, I normally had a best friend kind of designee in the same way to worry about the family should one day I not get back from a flight. So, there's that inherent risk of that. But what gave me the confidence was being a part of the whole process of getting these things ready. I mean, I've had some people naively think maybe I sat back and played AC-doocy until the rocket was ready, and they called me up and said, come on out, it's time to fly. Well, it wasn't that way. You were involved throughout the, I wasn't in Apollo, I came in late in the program, but I was on shuttle through the whole design phase, through the whole design development phase, participated in all design reviews, wrote RIDs, which are discrepancies on the design. So you were intimately involved in what this thing was going to look like and act like and how it was going to perform. Then you would test it. You tested in the vehicle, the actual hardware, throughout in the plant, in factories, and then when they were shipped to the Kennedy, special tests there that you were involved in. So you got a lot of confidence in the hardware and software. So that gave you added confidence. Also, I'll have to tell you that we had people, a great talent base in the program, a huge talent base, that were highly motivated to do it right. I've encountered many people one guy in Grumman, I was in the vehicle one night early in the morning testing. This young fellow was from Brooklyn. He was changing some wiring, and he leaned over me one time. He said, "Sir," he said, "I don't know why you want to go to the moon. I wouldn't want to go. But I'll tell you, I'm doing the best job I can to make sure this thing is right so you get there and back." And I think that was kind of a feeling I felt most of the workers that were on the program throughout the U.S., and there were a lot of them, over 400,000 at peak of Apollo, that felt that way, that this was important enough and they were going to do the best they could to make sure everything was right.
I would say that the most obvious thing to me these days, this day and age, is how our public at large actually has changed. And back in those days, the early 60s, late 50s, everybody was a Marine Corps, well, not a Marine Corps fighter, everybody was a fighter pilot. And the majority of them were also test pilots. And rightly or wrongly, in the squadrons in those days, we thought we could survive over anything. We thought whether we were the best one, most of them felt they were best one in that squadron. So you're willing to stick your neck out a little to make that accomplishment. And I'm sure that the Russians that were involved has kind of a similar attitude back in those days. Society and culture has changed over the years. They now try to make everything as safe as they possibly can. And less than half of the people are military pilots. And you could be a military helicopter pilot today. So in my opinion, what made that really in the end a success was the attitude of the people that we had that were participating in that program. We were willing to stick our necks out. And it's a good thing we were. You know, Apollo 7 was the first Apollo mission. Probably nobody out here has the faintest idea that that was the third attempt to have a first Apollo mission there. So I'm just saying our attitude is something that we're going to have to get back to, you know, to whether it's to go back to the moon or even eventually, a couple decades at least from now, go to Mars.
And then you.
Let me put a little management viewpoint. I was fortunate to work with every astronaut from John Glenn all through Apollo, and then later when I came back to Johnson Space Center, I got to deal with a lot of shuttle people. There's one thing about astronauts that I learned in that 25-year span, and that is I didn't think any of them were afraid of dying. They really weren't. What they were afraid of is making an error, screwing up in front of their peers. That drove them to really, really work hard to make sure that they didn't make a mistake. If somebody was going to make one, it was going to be somebody else. The other thing is, I've been asked before, what was the real job of mission control and all of that structure that was on the ground? And it took me a while to get to it, but in my opinion, our biggest job was to manage risk. We were trying to manage risk to the lowest level we could. But you got to remember something. When you strap into a rocket and you're sitting on probably 6 million pounds of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and hopefully you keep them apart, you are at risk. And no matter what you do, you can't manage risk to zero. So then it becomes Walt's argument, or your argument, maybe Al, what is the risk versus gain? So it becomes a risk versus gain game, which you face in industry, farming, it doesn't make any difference. Sometimes you have to take a risk to get something done. So that's kind of the 20,000-foot view, I think, of what it's like to undertake something like going and landing on the moon. Two really dynamic phases. One is Earth orbit, getting out of it. It's fairly easy comparative to that until you get to the moon, and then you got to land. And so you got these two dynamic phases at the end. We're going to face the same thing going back to the moon. We're going to face the same thing going on to Mars and beyond. I agree that that's just another step. But you need to think about the risk. It is a risky business, much, not too different, but a little, than getting in your airplane and flying. You can't ever drive that risk to zero either. So anyway, that was my...
Jerry, I'll make the point that those involved in the space program around the world are non-political, basically. If you look at the Association of Space Explorers, which encompasses everybody who's flown in space, you'll find people in that association from every country in the world, just about. However, from a personal standpoint, 1 month before my flight, the Russians lost 3 guys coming back from their space station because of a hatch malfunction, and they were exposed to a vacuum. The United States and Russia at the time were sort of looking at each other and not very friendly. But the space program immediately called us and told us that they had a problem and that they would keep us aware of what they were finding out with that problem, what caused the accident. And as a result of what the Russians told us, we changed the procedures on our flight to always wear a spacesuit if there was a possibility of opening a hatch anywhere. And that was based on what the Russians told us. Even though our countries were in conflict at that time, those in the space program recognized the risk to everybody, and they were all willing to help each other out, mitigate that risk.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I've got an internationalism question, but I'm going to save that for a second before I go there. So you all worked in an era when spaceflight was a government-supported endeavor. Of course, the spacecraft were largely built by contractors, aerospace contractors, under traditional arrangements. Things have changed. We just saw the launch of the Falcon Heavy, which a crazy billionaire decided to develop and fly on his own. And it was a remarkable success, once so far. So we're in this new era where we have still NASA operating at a much lower budget level, about a tenth of what it was at its height in the 60s, and probably doing easily 10 times more in terms of diversity of missions, so that's a huge challenge. You've got the entrepreneurs like Musk and Bezos and others who are building their own rocket systems, which are coming in and hopefully supporting what NASA does at a much lower cost and with competition. And then you've got international players, which I have another question about. Where do you think, and I really have been looking forward to asking you four guys this question. Do I need to get closer to this? Because you have a knowledge base that is really unique, an experience base really unique. Where is the sweet spot for these operators that gives us the maximum bang for our buck in which we can get things achieved quickly, efficiently, and as safely as possible?
Well, I personally feel like we don't have the same attitude towards competition in our industry that we used to at that time. And the costs of things today, much, much greater than what it was then. For example, the entire Apollo program, the original proposal, I think it was $20 billion. When we finished the program, it had gone over cost all the way up to $25 billion, which is closer to a one-year budget today for it. But if you convert that money today from what it was back in the 1960s, I think we're talking about $140 billion, $150 billion. So the costs are high. So you got to be willing to do that. Not to mention the fact that our culture and our society changes every year too. It's increasing tremendously. So we spend a lot more money on a lot of other things that keeps us from having the money that in those days we were willing to do to go to the moon. The Russians, they cover things a little bit better. They charge us only $80 million for take a guy up there for this ride to report. So that attitude is changing for us. It takes a big commitment, and it also takes an efficient organization. NASA today is, well, now they're 55, 60 years old. Back in the beginning, everybody was oriented towards what the goal was, to do that. And then as a government agency ages, it gets less efficient. They do more objectives they've added into it. And so you don't have the same economics as we had then. So we have to find a way to get back to it. We also have to continue to be realistic on how long it takes to get some of these places today, because we have folks, especially the private industry out there today, trying to sell on a basis that doesn't even come close to being sensible on, landing on Mars in 2024. Do you want to go along for that ride? So I'm just saying, we have got to get realistic and quit being just socialistically changing as time goes on.
Who's next?
Well, just going back to NASA's mission. NASA's mission to me is exploration. So to me, the way the commercial guys fit in is depending on the architecture of how you're going to get back to the moon or create this lunar colony, or Mars for that matter. If there's pieces of that architecture that involve just say getting up to low Earth orbit or even transit to the moon back and forth, the real exploration is done after you get to the surface, be it on the moon or on Mars. So any part of that architecture that the commercial guys could fill say, get in the low Earth orbit with either people and supplies. Clearly, NASA's not meant to be a truck driver to haul stuff up and down the low Earth orbit. That's not exploration. So if the commercial guys economically fit into that, I think surely that's what you use and take advantage of.
Okay, I think we need to understand the terms about these things that we're talking about, and I'm not sure we all do. We're talking about private industry building spacecraft to go somewhere. We're talking about entrepreneurial motivation, entrepreneurial work to do that. In my opinion, in my mind, there's only one entrepreneur out there. Only one. And that's Jeff Bezos. Why? Because he is the only one building spacecraft that's putting his own money in it. Everybody else is dependent on somebody else to fund what they're doing. SpaceX, Elon, God bless him, he's doing some wonderful things, but he is supported by the government. He gets his funding from the government. Boeing doing the same thing with their spacecraft. They're getting funded by the government. Jeff Bezos is the only one who's putting his own money where his mouth is. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about private industry doing these kinds of things, because I don't see any difference between SpaceX and North American Rockwell 40 years ago. They're both getting paid by the government to do what they did.
I'll ask
it may have been a lot more expensive back then because the bureaucracy is not as efficient, but basically it was the same thing.
Well, Al?
Well, you're a little bit wrong.
I'm always a little bit wrong.
Elon spent his own money
to
develop the Falcon. And he flew 2 or 3 of those Falcons. Then they moved to the Falcon 9 that they've got today. That's because it's got 9 engines on it. They moved to the Falcon. He started that development on his own, and then the government came to him and said, let us see if there's a way we can work together here, because they didn't have any way to get to low Earth orbit after the shuttle.
You think he could have done it if they hadn't stepped in?
I don't know. But
Well, he did raise $100 million also of private investment.
Well, and he's got some investors.
Yeah.
It's not the thing about Jeff is that Jeff's own money. I mean, it's out of his pocket. And I heard him say 2 years ago at the Space Foundation thing in Colorado Springs, they said, how are you funding, somebody asked him a question, how are you funding this? And Jeff said, I spend $1 billion, I sell $1 billion of stock a year in Amazon and put it into Blue Origin. So, bottom line, here's what I think. I think the commercial guys have shown enough zeal and enough expertise, frankly, that I think they're going to own, as much as what Fred is saying, they're going to own the domain of low Earth orbit. And they probably should. It's a hauling job. And that leaves NASA then to really get back to exploration, looking down the line. But remember, when NASA puts out money to go back to the moon or to Gateway or to Mars, whatever they're going to do, they're going to buy it from American industry. Nobody at NASA builds rockets. Mm-hmm. It's all their contractors. So in a way, we all come back to the commercial sector providing the hardware and the software that we need to get to outer space or somewhere in between. But I think the commercial guys are going to own low Earth orbit, and I think that's good. I think it gets the focus off of that for NASA. Let them look out.
Well, Al, if we make the presentation to him, he may give you a ride on one of those 5 seats in his command module, total module on it. The attitude is different when it comes to exploration, in my opinion. And not to mention the fact that they have not been realistic about what the cost is to do something like go to Mars. They haven't even come close on either the schedule or the cost of what it's going to take then. And you will find some people in today's society who are perfectly willing to stick their necks out to do it. And that you need that to do it, to go to those new places.
The worst thing about the Mars mission is that we got a lot of problems that we haven't solved yet to get there. One of it is radiation, and they are wrestling with that, because once you, if you tried to go to Mars in the command and service module, you'd probably not be cancer-free. There's just too much radiation. Same thing happens on Mars' surface. They've got an atmosphere there. It's mostly CO2, so you can't breathe it, but they don't have the shielding that our planet has. Our magnetosphere is actually what protects mostly from radiation. And by the way, the radiation risk isn't, I just learned this, guys, the doctors are not so worried so much about it. You're going into convulsions and more like an atomic nuclear weapon might do to you. It's that it ups the cancer risk. You probably make it back okay, but then in the next few years you'll probably see a deterioration. So it's a interesting problem. There's other problems, but that's the big one. And so we're not even ready to go to Mars. We don't have the technology yet to shield it and do it right.
That's
you know,
why
you know, Jerry, what's funny about that, I've been asked hundreds of times, what kind of a crew should we send to Mars? And I always look, whoever's asking the question, I look them in the eye and I say, me. Send me. Why send you? You're an old guy. You did that 40 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And I say, that's exactly why I should be on that flight. I'm an old guy, okay? Things happen when you get older, or things don't happen when you get older, that are very different from the way you were when you were 29 years old. And I'm just thinking about a 1.5-year flight in a small spacecraft, size of a Volkswagen Beetle, and you got 3 people sitting there, and if they're all 29, I guarantee you, before too long, somebody's going to be getting some pretty bright ideas about something, right? But I say, hey, send me. I'm an old guy. I'm very comfortable sitting and watching TV all day. So, and if radiation gets you, who cares? I'm an old guy. I've lived a great life. I can go any day, and no mistake about it. It would be great.
So I can see a great branding deal between SpaceX and Barco Lounge now, with you 3 guys in there and your remotes going,
Well, Al,
I can't get NFL today.
Al, I have to tell you that what they can do then is they can get control of the CO2 that we put out. So, and if they do that fast enough, we can go to Mars so we can survive.
Okay, guys, it's nap time on the spacecraft, right? So, just to steer back to innovation for a moment, we do seem as a country to innovate very well under pressure on a timeline and with a certain amount of competition, whether it's internal or external, which brings me to the question of China. Back in the space race days, we didn't really cooperate with the Soviet Union in manned space flight until before the Apollo-Soyuz test project. But on the robotics side, we were actually cooperating with them in the mid-'60s. We're beginning to have conversations at NASA with the Chinese about cooperating on the robotics side, because the stakes are a little lower. What do you all think about cooperation or competition, or perhaps co-opetition, if I may use that word, moving ahead? Is China a partner? Is China a competitor? They get to decide their budgets and their programs 10 and 15 years in advance, and they just march, and we don't get to do that. So it puts us in an interesting position. What do you think?
I've just had some brushing up against that issue. And it came through the aerospace medicine side of things that I won't get into. But, right now, we are not allowed to work with the Chinese. It is a restriction placed by the Congress. We can't do it. We're making some breakthroughs through the aerospace medicine side. They have finally started publishing some stuff that they've gotten from their astronauts, doing it with ESA, the European Space Agency, who are friendly with them, and we're beginning to learn a little bit through that avenue, a little bit about what they're doing. Have any of you guys been to China to look at their, I'll let you comment. I just know everybody that I know that has been over there said they were impressed, that these guys were good. And of course, when they put their mind to it, I think they can do it.
Yeah, you're right, Jerry.
And-
I just came back from China. I was there for a week at the Chinese Air Show working the U.S. Pavilion, but I got to know some of the Chinese, and I became very friendly with the guy who's the program manager for the space station that they're going to put up in 2023. I was invited to their space center, but 10 days before we were to go, the U.S. State Department called the guy that I work with and said, you can't go. And I'm confused about that because I could never figure out what harm it would do us if I visited their space center. Now, I can understand a Chinese person coming to visit our space center, they might pick up a few things, but what's going to happen if I go to there? So I am very confused about our attitude about that, but it goes back to the way the U.S. and Russia were kind of butting heads back in the late 60s when those in the space program told us that they'd had a problem and what to do about it. I think the Chinese are the same way. The Chinese taikonauts are just as close to astronauts and cosmonauts as anybody else. They all belong to the Association of Space Explorers, and when there's an annual meeting, they're there, just like everybody else, regardless of what the governments say. And I think that's the thing, that's the glue that holds a lot of these space programs together. And I'll tell you, the Chinese are no slouch. I am firmly convinced they're doing stuff that maybe we can't even do right now because we've not planned for it. But they're very, very good at what they do, and they're very far thinking, which we are not. And I think that's going to be a big, big plus for the Chinese in the long run because they plan way ahead and we plan a little ahead.
You know, they landed a robotic lander just recently on the far side, which is something we've been talking about doing for a long time. They just did it. And so it's on the far side of the moon. And so I think it was Charlie Duke was telling me he did get into their facility. He said you could eat off the floor. He said it was just beautiful, and the hardware was really, really well done.
No, I'd say the thing, from my experience, I worked 4 years on early Space Station Freedom, it was called at the time. And I was with Grumman at the time, and we won a contract, and I headed up the system engineering integration contract on Space Station. So in that role, I had to work obviously closely with ESA for their Columbia module, with the JEM, the Japanese experiment module, Japanese people. Mitsubishi Heavy was mainly who I interfaced with. And of course Canada with the second arm they built, robotic arm that's on Space Station. And it's clear when you're working that way, unlike I think the hardships we saw working with the Russians on ASTP, you have to have the work done by this mix of people totally separate from the governments, where there's no government political involvement. It's now just a bunch of people that are all primarily engineers that are interested in the overall mission and getting the job done. And it has to get to that kind of a climate to do anything cooperative and integrated with, for instance, we're talking about China. You got to have an open kimono, so to speak. I know on ASTP, for a while they were passing written notes back and forth rather than open communication to talk about issues. And you can't operate that way. So it has to be beyond the governments involved to say, okay, we condone that this group is now going to go off and take on this task and this mission and get it done. If you don't get to that kind of a climate, it becomes very, very difficult.
But the Chinese have always been, when it comes to intellectually on something, they're sitting at the top, those people that apply themselves. Then there's the political aspect of it. But I see in the last 20, 30 years, the ones that have really made progress for their country have been the Chinese in doing this. The decision of where to go and when to do that, that's going to be a political decision. And it's always nice to work together with folks, but both, the Russians, the Chinese, and us, we're not all on the same wavelength for all of these jobs to do it. And there's still kind of competition that goes on to try to make your country look good when you do it. Frankly, I think that the next time that somebody lands on the moon, I think it's probably going to be the Chinese on doing that. Keep in mind, it's been 50 years since the Russians were in competition. Of course, they didn't even admit they were in a competition for at least another 10 years after that. But that's been a long time, and nobody else has been to the moon than us in 50 years.
I think we ought to be cheering the Russians or the Chinese on. They're doing some wonderful things, and I think it's really, in my opinion, it's bad policy for us to be aloof from that, because we're going to miss some of the important things that they're doing and maybe help us along with our own program. I think the Chinese, they've got some fantastic engineers working for them, and you know why they're fantastic? We've trained them. They've all gone to school here in this country, and they all have to go back to China when they finish with their school. They can't stay here. So, in fact, I gave out a scholarship to the University of Michigan. I was telling some people the other day. I gave out a scholarship to a math student to the University of Michigan. There were 100 people in the auditorium, got through with all that, took questions, and answers to the question was, are we going to go back to the moon? And I said, yeah, probably. It's going to be a long time. Well, do you think anybody else will go? And I said, yeah, sure. Who do you think is going to go next? I said, no question about it. The Chinese will be the next people on the moon. The two back rows in the auditorium stood up and cheered. What does that tell you? They're all Chinese.
That's where they were from, yeah.
We're teaching them, folks. We're teaching them how to do our job.
Well,
or their job.
there is another important fact. We also have to start getting realistic on what it costs to go to Mars. It is going to cost a hell of a lot, believe me. And the technology is going to be very tough to overcome. We can't get there with just what we've solved to go to the moon.
Well, I feel like I'm just getting started, but I think we're pretty close to our time limit. So I just wanted to close with a quote. Years ago, I had the privilege of interviewing Gene Kranz, who was also a flight director during the Apollo and Shuttle years. And this was for a History Channel show. So at the end of the interview, when you're doing History Channel shows, you usually say to your interviewee, do you have anything you want to add? And most of the times I go, no, I think we've talked about just about everything I wanted to say. So I asked Gene that question, and he looked down for a moment and thought. He looked back up at me with that crew cut and those steely missile man eyes of his, and he said, what America will dare, America can do. It gave me chills then, and it still does now, so let's dare again. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.
How's it going, everybody? My name is Ron Sparkman, and I'm the Chief Curiosity Correspondent for the Space Foundation Discovery Center and the CEO and founder of Stardom. Space exploration is important to me because it quite literally changed the course of my life. Understanding the cosmos and seeing what humans are capable of when they put their minds to it highlights the epitome of the human spirit and showed me and countless others what it is possible to achieve. By growing as a species and learning to come together like we have in efforts such as the International Space Station or putting rovers on Mars, we not only show the world hope, but boundless possibilities. Most importantly, space exploration shows us that there is space for all. No matter where you come from, you have a place in this world and the endless worlds beyond. And to think that a single species on a planet that's hosted trillions can somehow make it off this little rock and begin to travel among the stars is the grandest vision many of us can imagine. Space exploration has made me love stronger, work harder, and challenge myself to overcome nearly every fear that has ever held me back. And if space exploration can do that for a former couch potato DJ like me, imagine what it can do for you.
Thank you to the Apollo astronauts for sharing your story with us. And it makes me think about when we go back to the moon now and put the first female steps onto the lunar regolith, that iconic picture of Buzz Aldrin. We all know the one that I'm thinking of that was taken by Neil Armstrong. And what a lot of people don't know about Buzz Aldrin is that he was also on the Gemini 12 mission, and he did multiple spacewalks. But what I like the most is that he actually has a doctorate from MIT. Did you know that?
I did know that. And it's just one of his many accomplishments. Was also a fighter pilot, an author, coined that phrase "magnificent desolation" that has been so widely used to describe the lunar surface, and has been a great ongoing vocal proponent for crewed spaceflight, and has developed the concept of the Aldrin cycler, which is a viable engineering-based plan for getting humans to Mars and back in an affordable and efficient manner. But I'd like to take the opportunity, if I may, to highlight a couple of Buzz's truly great accomplishments, which we tend to overlook when we are examining the spaceflight world. Now, we are both science communicators, we're television hosts, we're science writers, and for people like us, I'm going to be honest and own up to this. One of the things that we really aspire to is being asked to do a guest spot on Big Bang Theory. And not only has Buzz achieved that, but he has also been granted that single highest accolade in all of pop culture, and that is to appear as himself on The Simpsons. That is a truly great accomplishment.
It absolutely is.
Probably actually witnessed by about as many people as watched the moon landing when you take into account reruns. So I have to tell you that Buzz has, in a sense, been part of my life since I was a kid. So I was very fortunate to grow up with eccentric parents who thought that spaceflight was more important than school. So I was excused from going to school in the late 60s and early 70s. I got to stay home and watch the moon landings. Courtesy of a note from my quite imperious father to my quite drunk British headmaster saying young Jeffrey will be staying home to watch the moon landing. So I had this double bonus. I got to watch this live on our little black and white telly in South London, and I didn't have to go to school. So no wonder I've got such a positive association with spaceflight. More specific than that, my dad wore one of those Omega watches.
My dad did too.
You're kidding.
No, I'm dead serious.
So on the back of this watch was inscribed the first watch worn on the moon, and it had Buzz's name on the back of it. So I was a bit of a snoopy kid, and I was always looking around and this and that. And my dad loved that watch. When he would come home from work every day, he would take the watch off and he'd put it carefully on his dresser. And one time I examined this, and I went to him and I said, Dad, why does your watch have Buzz Aldrin's name inscribed on the back? And he said, oh, Buzz gave that to me a while ago. And I said, really? I was only a little boy then, but transfixed by this because I'd watched the moon landings. How does my dad know Buzz? Why does my dad have a watch from Buzz Aldrin? And my dad was a very mysterious guy. We actually think he was a spy. So he said, oh, I did some work for NASA in the 60s and 70s, and Buzz gave me that watch as a thank you. So I quizzed Buzz about this. He claimed to have no recollection of it, which is exactly the answer you would give if you had given a watch to a spy as a thank you. So there's the mystery. There's the mystery of Dad and the Buzz Aldrin watch will never be solved. My dad's passed away since.
Now I gotta look at my dad's watch and contact my brothers, because my older brother is convinced that my dad was a spy also.
Really?
Absolutely, 100%. And he had an Omega watch.
People are going to think that we staged this, but this is extraordinary. Okay, yeah, we've definitely got some parallel mysteries going on here.
But it is amazing that I have a Neil Armstrong autograph to my dad, and then your dad has a Buzz Aldrin watch.
So if only we could get something cool from Michael Collins, we'd have the whole Apollo 11 mission covered. So before we see the interview with Buzz, I will leave you with one more amusing anecdote, and it is this. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of introducing Buzz's keynote at the International Space Development Conference in Toronto. I did the Friday night keynote. He was doing the Saturday night keynote. So when I spoke, he was sitting right there in front of me with his team and other astronauts. So no pressure, right? You're delivering your keynote, and the great Buzz Aldrin sitting right there, looking perhaps slightly disapproving, or maybe it was just the spotlights. So Saturday, I sit down with him before the dinner with my very copious notes for what I think is going to be my brilliant introduction to Buzz. And I said, so Colonel Aldrin, is there anything you'd like me to particularly mention, or anything you don't want me to cover? And he goes, yeah, I just want you to make sure to keep it short, because I have a lot to get through. So I was a bit taken aback by that, and I said, oh, okay, certainly, Colonel. I'm glad you said that, because I'm a bit of a talker. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, I know. I saw your speech last night. So I said, well, thank you very much, Colonel. And he goes, and here, wear this shirt. And he gave me this fantastic Get Yourself to Mars t-shirt, although it had a slightly different phrase, but you know the t-shirt I'm talking about. So I quickly went off backstage and I cut out about 60% of my introduction. And after that, it all went very well. But ladies and gentlemen, my modest claim to fame, I was once mildly told off by Buzz Aldrin just before introducing him on stage. And so with that, I invite you to enjoy this interview with the one, the only, the mighty Buzz Aldrin. What do you see as the mission of the National Space Society?
It focuses in regions, people who can gather together without traveling very far and support local events, but there's a unity that ties them together. And at one time, of course, it wasn't the National Space Society, it was merged between the L5 Society and other entities. And when Lori Garver asked me to be chairman, she was executive director. Hugh Downs, he and Von Braun started NSS. And it brought a more national opportunity for people of lots of different age groups to begin identifying and not just going to Star Wars or movies, or I can't keep up with them myself these days. Not everyone can go to a launch and do this. So it's a continuity in particular places. We have a Space Society of Australia, and Kirby Eichen becomes a friend. I look him up when I visit Australia. Hugh Downs, the Board of Governors. He and I were at the North Pole together.
That's a good bonding experience, I imagine, the North Pole.
And I went scuba diving with Werner von Braun.
Was he a good diver? Did he like being underwater? Or is his head always in the sky?
Well, I was leading the flight underwater, and we were picking up poker chips.
Really?
Yeah, and the idea was to move along and see what you could find as you're navigating. There are a lot of organizations that have been a joy for me to be with. But I think National Space Society is one that is available to all, and you don't have to dress up with a funny outfit to be a member. But it's pretty serious, and it goes into a lot of different branches and backgrounds and disciplines. But I think NSS really has an appeal and should have a presence in most of the professional societies, at least in letting people know or getting them to help spread the word around to maybe the younger, but it's not just the younger, it's maybe the people who are trying to get recognition because their company isn't quite big enough.
What do you think is a good way to engage with people who are interested in space but just don't know about us or don't don't feel that it's something that a civilian, an ordinary person could get involved with. How do we make this engagement in space attractive and easy for new people?
Well, space is just a different way of doing things, of getting somewhere. You don't have to build railroad tracks. You don't have to go plowing through the mud or whatever. But you get into orbit and you get there. You stay there for a while. You better bring along some air and some food and some way to get back down. But that's what makes the space society. It's not a society of people who've been there particularly.
You may have noticed that we have an enormous number of students here from all over the world, enthusiastic young space students.
That's quite a recent, and they seem to be uniform too.
I know, they're very well dressed and well behaved. So I grew up in the UK. I'm an American citizen, but my parents were very international. I grew up in the UK, and I had to wear the tie and the blazer. So I see the kids, and I go, I can relate, guys. I used to have to dress like that. But the enthusiasm and the forward thinking of these kids really impresses me. And it's one of the things I love about the NSS is we have this very international flavor. Do you feel that we benefit from internationalism? What is your view on international cooperation between countries in space exploration in general?
Well, I think it's great, and right now I'm very much interested in dealing with an international group, and I heard people discuss this over in China. How should we come together? Should everybody join together? Should it be one region? Should one country bring all of them together? And I listened, and I kept getting on the edge of my chair. And I said, wait a minute. Have you ever thought of bringing together the capable nations of getting together to do something? You know, everybody's not capable of doing those things. But if you let everybody have a vote because they're a member, that's not too good. But if you let it be dominated by a region, or wanted to do a whole lot of thinking about this, because right now, it took a while to reason that a race, which was what Apollo was. No, I think it was set off to be an advance of technology where we, this nation, was behind. And of course, it became a race because we put a destination into it. But it can become quite wasteful when there's a competition. If you're interested in doing things jointly together, it's best to compete at the design level, pick the best design, then cooperate at the operational level where you carry out things.
So that way we get the brightest minds coming up with their own ideas, we pick the best one, and then we take the industry and the resources to make the best one.
And I guess maybe that translates to chapters who doing something and they compete for the design level, and you pick out the best one, and then you go to work with that one.
Can we manage that as people to actually pick what's best for us collectively? It's a noble aim. Do you think we can get there through international cooperation?
Well, when you get into that, an awful lot depends on who can pay the most, who has the talent to do these things, and that certainly comes into my crucial analysis right now. So we got 5 capable nations: the U.S., Europe, Russia, Japan, and China. in some order, and the order is that the U.S. has the brains, and the desire, and the reputation to want to unify, so we can maybe get that point across. Right now, because of decisions and freedoms, the Europeans have been close enough, so they have an agreement with the Russians to work together at the moon. And the Europeans, their astronauts, are learning Chinese language because they have got some agreement with the Chinese. And, well, we want to, America's the greatest, so we want to be involved. And Japan kind of will sort of go along, but it's very crucial to not have a competition with China. I think we've already seen that with Russia we can work together, and there are ways that may not be too beneficial for them and for us, no matter whether they got good rocket engines or what. But to start off international relations with a competitiveness in space. And it gets into determining the rapidity of wanting to do certain coalitions of these nations. And I don't want to really get into that and why. And there are other things that are influencing us today, and that's the aging of certain components of our space program that have been initiated in the past, and they're getting older, or they haven't quite come to fruition yet. And there are various political reasons why each one kind of wants to keep going. And it makes it difficult to discontinue unless you got a better idea. And unless whoever's going to lose, you got something better for them to get into. Nobody wants to change.
What are the better ideas? What would you like to see us do in terms of space exploration and development? Where do you think we could best focus our energies?
Well, I don't think that many people 30, 40 years ago ever thought if we're going to get into reusability, it would be the first stage of the rocket. I got involved in flyback boosters that land on a runway, one way of bringing something back. But a spacecraft goes and does something. It's a lander, and we leave it there. Or we don't go and try and use a lander at the moon again. No, we will go to a different place. We use designs similar, but they come back and they land in the ocean, and they're not really quite so suitable. But you can segment the areas where it is appropriate to reuse something, is how you can get it to where you can make it readily available. And there's sometimes when a stage of a rocket goes somewhere, sometimes it's inconvenient to turn it around and bring it back, but there are always different ways if you can open your mind and think. And this I think brings up what I hope comes out of the togetherness of NSS, and that's the exchange of ideas that stimulate something I didn't think of before, because he just mentioned something. Maybe I got a good idea. So it's maybe the competition of just because we're doing it that way, that doesn't mean there might not be a better way of doing something. When I first started looking at Rendezvous, I wasn't at all satisfied that the people knew what in the world they were doing. But it was so simple and basic. Now, of course, being in one airplane and trying to catch another airplane, that gives you a little advantage in thinking about things. And I think the various backgrounds that diverse people have when they come together can look at somebody else's problem that he's been stuck in the rut about, and he may think of something, and we call that out-of-the-box thinking.
Do you feel that's a product of different backgrounds and different experiences, different cultural viewpoints? We come together and are we better at problem solving as an international group?
I think the inventiveness of the Western societies have, for various reasons, needed to come up with maybe better ways, maybe a freer society. I think in the Asian world, it has somewhat been predominated by memorizing something or rote learning. This is something I want you to remember how to do that. Instead of, I got something here, I want you to find out a better way to do it.
So it's easy for us to get perhaps stuck in the familiar. We know the system, there's inertia, and you have a very inventive and innovative mind. You have an original way of looking at things, and I know you said thinking outside of the box. How do you train your mind to do that? Is this a conscious thing?
I just told you.
Well, but I mean you personally, is this a daily exercise for you? You're always looking for the next thing. You're a very innovative person.
Yeah, but you can bark up the wrong tree, and you can follow something doggedly. I'm gonna make this work no matter what, and then you find out it was not meant to be. And there are a lot of blind alleys in a new business like space where mass, velocity, duration, consumables, all of these things that are variable. You go somewhere, how are you going to get back, and what do you need? All of these sort of come in to play. It's not just a quick, how do I do this better? Because that may snowball into and I'm finding right now, to me, what is very satisfying is that when I make a change here, I can do it because of this one, and then this one plays into that one, and pretty soon it all, I hope, fits together. And I don't think if you just look at this one, how do I do that best, that you're going to see the big picture at all. And I don't know, I just feel I'm so fortunate to think that I have that. Now all I have to do is convince other people that I'm right.
It's a noble aim. So we're at an exciting time in spaceflight now. We have all these independent groups starting. We've got space tourism. We're so close. We're so close to asteroid mining. How do you feel about this enormous transformation of which the NSS has, in a sense, kept the dream alive to a degree all these years and encouraged these small companies? And now we go to a thing like ISDC, and it's full of independent spaceflight companies, all with their own ideas. What do you think? Are you excited?
Yeah, sometimes I get focused on one thing, and one was tourism. How do we get people want to do something dangerous? Well, there's a thrill, but yeah, there's a hazard to it, and there's a notoriety. And after a while, people will adjust to that, look at the odds, and there's somebody who's going to want to walk the tightrope from one building to another. Or somebody who's going to want to jump out of an airplane. Not me. If the engine's working, I want to stay in the airplane. So you find that there's just a big pool to choose from. And so I think each person somehow has to feel what is your niche. And sometimes I've been asked, well, what advice would you give? Well, stretch out your arms, engage so many things as you go through life, pick out the ones and throw away the other ones, and be ready to change horses if you need to.
It's a very inspiring message. Let's talk about something that's near and dear to your heart. Let's talk about Mars. Why should we go to Mars?
Someone will. Why not us? When the time is right. And a number of years ago, we were caught up with enthusiasm, and we'll get to Mars at a normal pace in the mid-'80s, 1980s. If we speed it up, maybe the early. But if we are just kind of slow about it, it'll be 1990 or something like that. Man, that passed us by so fast. And a lot depends on the national priorities and whether there are other diversions and the leadership. And it's troubling when there's such a dispute about the leadership, and it's regrettable that there's a revision with major administration changes. There really needs to be more of a continuity rather than, I want to put my brand on what's going to happen. We have, as I can see it, we've just embarked on a station and reusability in the shuttle. And one kind of fed on the other, and the ways of getting internationals and getting Congress behind it meant certain compromises, and to get back to tourism, there was an opportunity for the U.S. to build a crew return vehicle that would take people up and crew return, and it would leave them up there. Opportunities will come, and they'll be taken advantage of. And we've missed a good number, I think. I can project ahead and kind of think that maybe, in retrospect, a number of decisions have not been as good as they could have been. And I was very motivated at one time to have a think tank that would look at all the inflection points that we were involved in and look at each one, and a decision was made. And now, was it a good one or not so good? Let's learn from it and look at all of these. And there are a lot of opportunities that were lost for a lot of reasons. I know there are many people that are just in love with the shuttle, but I think in the future it will prove to be a diversion that was not quite worth the time and the effort to move in that direction, and then to have nothing kind of left over. And I think the space station in some ways fits into that. It's reached a point now where whatever the original lifetime of it was 2016 and 2020, 2024, and now I freely hear 2028, and things are getting old, and they're not gonna, And besides, you do something there, it means you can't do something somewhere else in a different way. And it's expensive. And we want to privatize it. It's too expensive. Except if you, and once you put something there, it's there. You can't be moving it around. And
So-
I'm not sure that all the things that we came up with that made Apollo work, lunar orbit rendezvous, instead of one ship getting into orbit and then doing most everything, that was the big power way of doing it. The sophisticated way was splitting things apart and throwing things away, not bringing them all back, leaving one on the surface, and the only thing that returns is the capsule that the crew's in. Well, we're learning how to do things quite a bit different, and I don't think we've reached the limit at all. I mean, I look at, we've got something that has to adjust to the surface of the moon from orbit. Well, that's a lander. And what's in between kind of goes from space to space. And try and make one do the other or do all may not be the cleverest way, but I'm just giving you some examples of thinking differently and then seeing whether it leads to something that makes sense.
I love that. I'd like you to use your fantastic imagination that has stayed so active in spaceflight and dream big for me, the future. What do you want to see? Where do you want us to go? What should we do? What should our biggest goal in spaceflight be? What's the message that you want us to get across to the world of spaceflight?
Resources that we don't have on Earth, they're going to be very valuable. Now, how much we can use the lower gravity, the absence of an atmosphere to our advantage on the moon, I think we're going to find that out. It's not a place where when you go there, it's so hard to get back that you're going to want to stay a long time. It's consumables. Because I think when you go there, that you come back and a new crew and the old crew comes back. I'm not sure that that's fully accepted now. Now Mars is a different case. What we did, when you really analyze it at the moon, we spent 2 guys for 1 day. 2-3 months later, 2 guys for 1 day. We had a little interruption, didn't quite work out, so 6-7 months to get 2 guys for 1 day. And we got a little bold, we put a little mobility in it. So at the end, when the Vietnam War and other things kind of ran us out of money, we had 6 out of 7 successful launch and landing and back. And we got 2 guys for 3 days, and nobody's been back since. Now that's a visit, and a very short visit, and a long time in between, and we went to different places. Now Mars, you're going to have a much different situation. Back in the old days, I used to hate it when I'd hear somebody say back in the old days. We thought, well, maybe we'd go to Mars and stay 20 days or 30 days. Doesn't work that way. Very expensive getting there. You're leaving too late to get there, and you're leaving too early to only have a short time there. So that didn't last. But if you go at the best time on fuel, and you come back at the best time in fuel, you got about 1.5 years. and it's vacant for 6 months, 8 months, depending on how energetic. But that's a visit, and it's an economic visit. But you visit, you visit, you visit. That's not accumulating too much. Well, you can visit, stay there, and somebody else comes, but then you go back home. So everybody who goes comes back home. Well, that is 4.5 years staying there, or 7.5, or 10. From a crew point of view and utility, that's not too good. You're not going to go back and do it again. And if the same number of people go that come back, you have a fixed, steady state, and you never get any higher than that. So it's not too good from a crew point of view. You pay for getting people there, you pay for getting them back, and it's not a red-hot presidential commitment. So a visit isn't, occupy isn't. I think we can get away with a commitment to an occupy, because it sounds better, because that's what we should do at the moon. You don't need to emigrate and stay there the rest of your life. But when you really look at the advantages of going there, paying for somebody to go there, paying for somebody to go here, again, you don't have to bring them back. And each one that goes there knows what he's getting into right from the very beginning, and he either likes it or he doesn't like it. So there's a kind of a crew advantage if, I mean, it's not one crew goes, comes back, another one goes, but then the third one goes, and they become the pilgrims, the pioneers of their country or of humanity, and the other two, just the golfers. And I really think that the advantages so much, especially since we got a moon, and we can do all the things we need to at the moon, the critical things, so that when we go to Mars, we know what we're doing, or we intentionally get to do things there. We don't do the toughest things there. We do things that are similar to what we simulated here, and then when we do it, we've tested things so much that we know it's going to work the first time it gets there. And there are ways of assuring this. And now just look at the crew position, look at the cost, and look at the presidential commitment. It isn't going to happen until 2 more presidents, and they may chicken out by then. But, and I think this is the kind of analysis that somebody has to go through and then say, oh, you're wrong, this isn't going to be important, or this isn't. But when the last time you flew in space is getting pretty close to 50 years ago, you got a lot of time to think about these things.
Well, yeah, and you've been doing a lot of thinking. So next year it is 50 years since a pretty spectacular adventure you went on. Where would you like to see us 50 years after that? Where should we be on the 100th anniversary?
Many breakthroughs, speed, propulsion, the limitations of the human body. And I've given a lot of thought to what those are and how we can deal with them. And because of some of my own experiences in families, I really think that mental health may be very well the most critical thing that we have to take into account from the very early stages, especially if we're going to talk about migrating. And that's better than a permanent settlement. Heck, you can visit your settlement many times before you decide to make it permanent or colonize. You decide after a while, I'll colonize. I don't know what the right word is, Though I know what the wrong word is, one way. I just do not like the use of that. And I sometimes chide the people that say, oh man, we got to get there in a hurry. We got to get there in weeks, not months. So I said to a congressman, if you're going to spend the rest of your life there, why do you care how long it takes you to get there? But some people feel that they're responsible for all these big decisions, and they don't want to be a part of stranding somebody somewhere else. That's his decision. That's the government's, that's the world's decision, to see whether there are people that fit into the expansion outward. And I've led up to a phrase that I was given, I don't want to take credit for everything, to a phrase I was given to somebody who worked on a speech. We explore, or we expire. One of the two. We can take our choice.
That's so wonderful. I think that's a great place to end. Unless there's anything else that you wanted to say.
Through.
Thank you so much.
Greetings from Island of the Gods, Bali, Indonesia. My name is Anna Camaro, and I'm the founder of Antarexa Space Global. I've been mesmerized by the vastness of the galaxy and how we're nothing but a speck of dust. I went to Baikonur to see the Soyuz rocket launch, and I believe that everyone should experience all of these inspiring moments in their lives, so that we can increase the collective consciousness for humankind. I created Antarexa, a space portal that focuses on increasing Indonesia's interest and growing awareness of the space industry. My goal is to inspire the Artemis generation and to identify and empower local talents so that Indonesia can contribute to the growing global space economy. Through international cooperations, I hope to learn and grow from all of you, the global space community, so that together we can become an advanced space society. Come meet me in Bali for a magical astrotourism or a space camp. Last but not least, I would like to thank the National Space Society and Dr. Sion Proctor for this opportunity to be a part of an amazing global event. From Bali, Indonesia, Om Swastiastu.
The one and only Buzz Aldrin. Well, that concludes the Apollo historic section of our broadcast. I hope you enjoyed the exclusive, never-before-seen interview with Dr. Colonel Buzz Aldrin, and we hope you enjoyed the Apollo panel. You know, Cyan, I once emceed an Apollo panel myself at Space Fest a few years ago, and it really was one of the highlights of my career. I had 9 Apollo astronauts on stage and Rick Armstrong, and I had them at my mercy for 90 whole minutes. And I spent a long time preparing questions that I thought and hoped they'd never been asked before. And the highlight of the panel for me was as follows. I said, gentlemen, I'm going to ask you a question, an unusual question. And when you hear this question, I don't want you to think about it. I want an instantaneous gut reaction. And if you feel the answer to this question is yes, I want you to just raise your right hand. And so the question was this. Gentlemen of Apollo, do you think, yes or no, that somewhere in the universe there is some form of life? And all but one instantly put their hands up. I'm not going to tell you which one it was who didn't put his hand up. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. 9 out of 10 Apollo astronauts believe the answer to is there extraterrestrial life is yes.
Well, you know, it's funny you bring that up because I actually do believe that there is extraterrestrial life out there somewhere. And the way I came to that conclusion was because I was on a TV show called Genius by Stephen Hawking. So with Stephen Hawking, he wanted to know whether or not he could get me to think like a genius and understand the processes of how we go about finding exoplanets and life in the universe. And so I won't tell you whether I passed or not when it came
no
to...
pressure. Stephen Hawking asks if you're a genius. Yes
Right,
or no?
exactly. But the nice thing is that there are people out there that are actually looking for exoplanets, but not just exoplanets, but life on those planets. And one of those people is Dr. Sarah Seeger, and she is an astrophysicist and planetary scientist at MIT. And what she does is that she looks for biosignatures in the atmosphere of exoplanets. Mind blown, right? Because we're looking at not only finding a planet out there, but how do you know it's so far away that there's life? And so then you got to think about, well, is there anything in the atmosphere that would enable you to determine this? And that's what she does her research on. She is literally looking for Earth's twin out there among billions of stars. And so let's hear it from Sarah.
Hi everybody, I'm Professor Sarah Seeger from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm here not in this gorgeous northern night, but I'm actually in my home with this background of the stars because I wanted to start by sharing with you or reminding you that every star is the sun. And if our sun has planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, etc., surely those other stars should have planets also, and they do. And actually, we know of thousands of planets orbiting other stars. In our night sky, if you have great eyesight and are in a super dark site, you could see maybe 1,000 stars. But our galaxy, the Milky Way, has hundreds of billions of stars. And in our universe, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. So the number of planets out there is just unbelievable. And we're hoping that some of them have life on it. We're hoping that some of the planets have life on them, and that the life breathes out gases that can accumulate in the atmosphere that someday we might be able to detect with our telescopes. Now, we'd only be able to detect planets and signs of life in their atmospheres around the very, very nearest stars. And all of that is what I'm going to tell you about today. So what I'm going to start with So my title is Exoplanets and the Search for New Worlds. And I'm going to start by talking to you about the TESS mission. TESS stands for Transiting Exoplanet Survey Satellite. Now on April 18th, 2018, we had a spectacular launch. The day was so crystal clear, and that rocket had the brightest plume I've ever seen. And right inside the tippy top of that rocket was a telescope called TESS. And this telescope actually is not very big. Here it is while it was still being worked on in the clean room at Northrop Grumman. And you can see people there for size. And what you can see are the solar panels. Those are the most obvious thing out to the side. Those were deployed, stowed for launch, and they were deployed after launch. You can see the antenna. And inside, you can see these 4 identical cameras. Well, you can't see them because they've got a cover on and a giant baffle. In this image, it's a close-up, and you can see one of the TESS cameras. The actual aperture is not very big. It's only about 10 centimeters in diameter. And what you can see, that black rib thing, is a giant baffle. And that baffle is designed to block out light from Earth and from the moon and other things. Now, each of these 4 cameras has a CCD detector at its base, and they're all placed together on a platform, and there's like this sun shield that goes around them. Now, inside the spacecraft, there's the usual spacecraft hardware, like data storage, there's a radio for communications, there's batteries that store up the power from the solar panels. Here are some of the test team members. A long time ago, they were fooling around with the camera, one of the test cameras, showing that it actually still worked even at room temperature, because these cameras actually are cooled to very cold temperatures. So this is an artist's conception and animation of the test mission in space. And these 4 cameras actually are aligned in a special way so that they cover a large strip of the sky. Each camera is about 24 by 24 degrees, if that means anything to you. And the cameras are made to tile the sky in strips that we call sectors. So each of these sectors lasts for about a month. And Tess's job is to tile the sky. Tess has already finished the southern hemisphere, and it's nearly finished with the northern hemisphere. So actually, Tess observes so many stars. It's just unbelievable how many. This is just 3/4 of one of the cameras. And this is just like a beauty picture, just to show you how many gorgeous stars are out there in the Tess mission. It's amazing to just wonder, like, how many planets could be out there in the sky, and how many of them Tess might be able to find. So Tess is actually searching for planets by the transit technique. This is a very established, very mature method to find planets. You can see on the top is an artist's conception of a star, like our sun, with a planet going in front of it. And the bottom is actually showing you the so-called light curve. It's the star brightness as a function of time. So you can see that when the planet goes in front of the starlight drops by a tiny amount. Actually, it's related to the planet to star area. And when the planet finishes transiting, the star returns to its normal brightness. So I'm actually going to just go back to this other animation for a moment. Because I just wanted to convey to you how many stars Tess is trying to look for data in. First of all, Tess has a very unique 13.7 day, highly elliptical, what we call cislunar orbit about Earth. So it's got about 27.4 day observing period per segment. And you can see that at the top, the segments overlap in this so-called continuous, it's not a continuous viewing zone, but it's like this overlapping zone. And there we can detect planets with much longer periods. Typically, Tess is sensitive to planets with a period of about half a month or so. So out of this whole night sky, Tess is actually monitoring 200,000 stars at a 2-minute cadence. But it actually monitors the full frame image. The data has to be binned on board because the data rate to the Earth can't let us, it's not high enough for us to get all our data down. And then we're looking at millions and millions of stars that are binned to 30 minutes. All right, so our goal is to find transiting planets. And here's that same beauty image with just one star selected for you to see some real data. So again, our goal is to monitor the star brightness as a function of time and to get a time series for all the stars that we can. And that would be 20,000 for every sector, every 1 month sector. That would be about 20,000 2-minute cadence, what we call postage stamp images, and about 1 million 30-minute cadence images. Now what you see in the graph, forget about the y-axis for a moment. The x-axis is time in hours. And you see the star brightness, which are the little blue points. The black points are bin data, and the red is a model fit, the best fit model to the data. And you can see the star brightness with time is more or less constant. And then the brightness drops when the planet transits the star. And we're actually using computers to go through all the data and to automatically look for planets. It's a really big job. Okay, so we actually have sophisticated computer algorithms that do almost all of the work. And these algorithms were developed over many, many years. They're heritage from NASA's Kepler mission in part, and they're also just code that people have put together and made lots of parts of it freely available. So what these computers algorithms do is they create a time series, they clean up the data, they search for transits, that little drop in brightness, and they reject variable stars and binary stars where possible. There's actually a lot of false positives. That's the main problem, is that a lot of things can look like a little drop in brightness. When the computer has done all of this work, then human vetters sort through the rest by visually inspecting the light curves. And at the same time, they look at auxiliary data products. So every sector, we go from millions of stars down to about 100 test objects of interest. Now, I played a big role on the TESS mission. I was the deputy science director for a number of years, and my job was to set up the team and the process that led to finding these planet candidates. We just call them planet candidates because a lot of work has to be done to actually determine whether a drop in brightness is due to a planet or something else. So once we have a planet candidate, we give it out to the community of astronomers, the TESS team, and other people, and their goal is to follow up the planets, to look for other signs, to make sure to see if it's a planet or a binary star or another type of false positive. And I won't go through all the details, but I just wanted you to know that there are several different steps, and there are several hundred astronomers all around the globe who are helping out with TESS. So now I just wanted to take a moment and walk you through a few light curves. And then I'm going to let you try to find some planets yourself. And so what you're seeing in this image here is what we traditionally have the computer make on its own. Once the computer finds an object that it flags, it actually outputs, honestly, it can output like a 30-page or 100-page report for us. But I'm only going to show you the tiniest amount of data because it's all we really have time to go through right now. So on the top here, what you're looking at is the star brightness as a function of time. And the time is listed in days. So it looks like it's about a month. So the drop in brightness actually is flagged for you in this case by the computer, by the little triangles at the bottom of the top panel. So here the computer thinks it has seen two transits. We'd like to see more than one transit, otherwise we don't know if it's a repeating pattern that is a planet going around its star. The bottom plot is a phased light curve, we call it, where the transits are superimposed on each other. The data is so-called bin together, and we can now see the transit much more clearly. So what we're looking for when we look for a planet is we're looking for a box shape, we're looking for a small drop in brightness, and we're looking for a flat bottom light curve. The reason we're looking for a box shape is because when a planet goes in front of the star, the planet's very small and moving pretty quickly, and it crosses the limb of the star relatively quickly, and so that's why you get a box shape. If it's two stars eclipsing each other, which is one of our most common false positives, in that case, it would be a more slow crossing because the stars eclipsing each other are very big as projected on each other, and it takes a lot longer for the transit to happen. For the flat bottom, same thing. The planet, if it's a planet, will be fully superimposed on the star while it's transiting, whereas for a binary star, the stars will take a long time they'll never really flat bottom, because as this one star eclipses the other, it's just taking out a differing amount of the background the background star as a function of time. So now I'm going to go through a few of them, and you can like take notes or just in your head wonder if you think it's a planet or not, and then I'll come back again and we'll go through each of them together. So remember, you're looking for a box shape, a small drop in brightness, and a flat bottom light curve. Needless to say, this one doesn't have any of those properties. It's a V shape. It's definitely not a box shape, and it's no flat bottom either. Here are two different ones for you to look at. And remember, the blue triangle is what the computer thinks is a transit. Remember what you're looking for. Box shape, flat bottom, small drop. It's hard for you to tell what's a small drop. The flux is just what we call the brightness of the star, and it's in relative units here. The one on the top and bottom are different in these cases, in this one. Actually, no, sorry. This is the same one on the top and bottom, just zoomed in. So you're here to decide whether you think this is a planet candidate or something else. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the beginning and I'll walk you through what you think these are. This one is not a planet. It is a binary star. And the way we can tell that is because it's got this very V-shaped light curve, and what it means is we must have two very big objects that are eclipsing each other. If you look at the top plot, where the data is not phase folded yet, is a different shape, or a different drop in brightness rather. And that's because the two stars eclipsing each other are different sizes. Okay, this one is not a, this is actually two different ones. And the blue triangles, again, are where the computer thinks there's a transit. The one on top is some kind of eclipsing binary star. It might even be what we call a contact binary star. The one on the bottom is actually a variable star, probably due to spots. And as the star is slowly rotating, different amounts of brightness of the star are reaching us because there's different amounts of spots covering it. This one is actually a stellar, literally stellar example of a planet. It's actually a pretty big planet. We call it a hot Jupiter. And this one is like just such a classical image of a transit. If you were part of the test team and searching for transits, you would only need to look at this for like a second to know it was a planet because it has these very box shape, this flat bottom. And again, it's hard for you to tell, but it has, well, it has a relatively small drop in brightness. It's a very clean transit light curve. I hope you can admire it for a moment. This one is a sawtooth pattern. It's got to be some kind of variable star. Even though the computer thought there was a transit here, this is definitely not a transit. And in the bottom plot, again, you can see the red line is our best fit model. It's not fitting the data very well, is it? The red line hardly goes through any points. This one's definitely not a planet. What about this one? Now, most people I run these slides by who are not trained, at least you weren't trained, you only got a 1-minute training, they usually think this is a planet. It's got a small drop in brightness. According to the best fit model, it's a pretty box shape and flat bottom. But in fact, this is not. This one is just some kind of noise. And the way we reach that conclusion is because we see before the transit happens and after. Like if you look after the transit, the data rises. And so it's just not really following the model. It's not really a great blocking out the light and then the light coming back to normal. Okay, this is our last one. And look at the top panel. It's showing you the blue triangles. Like it looks like every less than a day, actually. So if this is a planet, it's actually orbiting its star incredibly quickly. At the bottom panel, you see, again, the phase-folded plot, or the bin data. And there, it looks pretty nice, actually. And if you thought this one was a planet, you were right. So I'm now going to walk through a few of Tess's discoveries. The one we just looked at, this light curve, belongs to a planet called LHS 3844. I'm showing you an artist's conception of the planet. We actually have no idea what the planet looks like, honestly. We have that light curve. We have some other data. We don't know a lot about it. We know this planet is 1.3 times the size of Earth. We know it's over 2 times Earth's mass. Its year, the time it takes to orbit its star, is only 11 hours. Remember all those little blue triangles? Its day-side temperature is very, very hot. Actually, astronomers took this object and they followed it up with another telescope called the Spitzer Space Telescope. And Spitzer observed in the infrared. It's no longer operational. But this planet actually has a day-side temperature that's incredibly hot. It's nearly 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, and that would be about 700 degrees Celsius. This planet actually likely has no atmosphere, because the observers monitored the planet as it was orbiting the star, and they saw that they saw that one side of the planet was so hot, and the other side was incredibly cold. And for a planet to be very hot on one side and very cold on another, it likely means the planet has no atmosphere. Now, I forgot to mention that planets so close to the star, planets that have a very short period, that their orbit is only 11 hours, by Kepler's third law, they're also orbiting very close to the star. And planets very close to the star over time become what we call tidally locked. Just like the moon shows the same face to Earth at all times, these planets would show the same face to their host star at all times. That means one side is permanently in the day and one side is permanently in the night. Now, if there is any atmosphere, it's most likely that the heat would get circulated around the planet. As long as the planet has a thin atmosphere, it should equal out to some degree, in most cases. And this planet didn't show that, and that's why we infer it likely has no atmosphere. Another system that is one of our favorites from TESS is called the TOI 270 system. I'm showing you the light curves, the transit light curves in the top right corner, and this is just an artist's conception, showing you that it has 3 planets named TOI 270b, TOI 270c, and TOI 270d. Now, each of these planets is not like Earth in any way, and for comparison, Earth is shown in the top left. But it's a really interesting system for a reason I want to explain to you. That the inner planet is what we think is a rocky planet, it's just about Earth size. And the outer 2 planets are what we call mini Neptunes. It's over 2 times the size of Earth, between 2 to, let's say, 4 times Earth size. And why these are so interesting is they help frame one of the biggest puzzles we have in exoplanets right now. And that is that these 2 planets, or that is that these so-called mini Neptunes are incredibly common. They are likely the most common type of planet in our galaxy, yet there is no solar system counterpart to them. So it turns out that in our solar system, we have the terrestrial planets like Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and we have the so-called giant planets like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. But we don't have anything 2 to 3 times the size of Earth. Now, these common planets, we actually don't know what they're made of. We don't know how they formed. There's a lot of different theories about them. But one thing astronomers have found that might lead to clues to what these mini Neptunes are is the so-called radius valley. If we count up the planets, and don't worry about the y-axis for now, it says number of planets per star, but you can just think of this like a regular histogram. It's the number of planets per star, and the x-axis is the planet size. And there's a so-called radius valley in that for small planets that we can detect, about 1 Earth radius or a little bigger, there's a good number of them. And then there's a good number of planets 2 to 3 times the size of Earth, but there's a little bit of a gap in the middle. And astronomers think this is because that the rocky planets, the small planets, that they're sculpted, that over the lifetime of the star, these smaller planets used to be bigger, but over the lifetime of the star they were eroded by the star's wind and high energy particles, and that they actually have kind of been slowly evaporated with time. Whereas the mini Neptunes, they're typically a little farther away from the star and that they've managed to hold on most of what they were born with. So we actually think that if we have planets in the same system that span this radius valley, then in the future, when we're able to learn more about the planets, we will actually be able to help solve this puzzle. So the last planet of TESS I will tell you about, it's TOI 700d. And by the way, we get to name the planets. We're not allowed to name them with our dog's name or our husband's or our partner's name. We actually have to give it a catalog name. And so in this case, if it doesn't already have a easy to say or a well-known name, we actually can name it, but we have to name it after our catalog. TOI means Test Object of Interest, and when it becomes a planet, we'll just be calling it TESS 700d. So the TESS 700 system has 3 planets that we know of, and the one we're most interested in is TOI 700d. And TOI 700d is a rocky planet, and it orbits in its star's so-called habitable zone, the zone around the star where the planet is heated to be not too hot, not too cold, but just right for life. That is an oversimplification, because we don't know anything about the planet's atmosphere. We don't know about its greenhouse gas power in the atmosphere. We have no idea what the surface temperature is. Nonetheless, it's really, we're trying to count up as many planets as possible in their host star's habitable zone. All right, so we actually count up all our planets by putting them on a graph. And this graph is showing you the distance of the actual star from Earth. This graph is actually showing you the planet radius as a function of the distance from our Earth in units of parsec. 1 parsec is about 3 light years. But what you can see here is that the TESS planets, which are yellow and orange, are relatively close to Earth actually. Everything is still incredibly far away, but these planets are much closer than the blue ones, which are found by other TESS, are found by other missions other than TESS. So TESS is finding a lot of planets. So far we've found 2,000 planet candidates that we've released to the community to follow up. So this part of the talk now, I'm finished talking about TESS, and now I'm going to move on to talk about what we're going to do with the planets. You can think of TESS as kind of like a legacy catalog. The goal is to find all of the most interesting transiting planets around relatively nearby stars that are bright enough for follow-up observations. And we actually are all eagerly awaiting the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope. The James Webb Space Telescope is 6.5 meters in diameter, and it will operate at infrared wavelengths. And it will orbit very far away from Earth, where it's a quiet, very special environment for astronomy. And we sometimes call the TESS mission the finder scope for the James Webb, because it's finding all these interesting planets that we're going to follow up. It's not just the James Webb Space Telescope we have to look forward to, but we're also trying to we're also looking forward to other telescopes. For example, the 30-meter telescope and other extremely large ground-based telescopes. 30 meters is huge. Just want you to think about that for a moment, how big 30 meters is. And this is an artist's conception of what the TMT would look like. Huge telescope with a giant dome. Each of these telescopes is going to be able to follow up the atmospheres of planets, some of the planets that TESS is finding. My favorite next-generation telescope is a concept called the Starshade. The Starshade can launch with a telescope. Its petals will unfurl from a stowed position and snap into place. The Starshade is a specially shaped giant screen, tens of meters in diameter, and it would formation fly tens of thousands of kilometers away from the telescope. They would have to line up incredibly precisely so that the Starshade can block out the starlight so we can see planets directly. Starshade is a big ongoing project supported by many different organizations, especially by NASA. Here's myself and a couple of team members with one of the pedals. This is a prototype used for manufacturing tolerance verification tests to demonstrate that we could make the pedal. Actually, it has to be made to a very special shape in order to block out light from the star, precisely enough for us to discover and follow up Earth's. Here's a picture from, this is from a few years ago actually, but it's from the Starshade lab at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And here you can see different prototype scale versions of the Starshade, including the one in the middle that the person is touching. We call it membrane management, how we're going to still unfold all the material that we need to block out starlight and have the Starshade be functional. Now, I want to tell you how we're going to study planet atmospheres to solve problems like about the mini Neptune radius valley, and how we're going to ultimately search for signs of life on planets far away. Now, I'm confident that most of you have seen a rainbow. But what you might not know is that if you could look at the rainbow very closely, you would see pieces of the rainbow missing, some small colors missing. And these, I'm going to show you now a picture of our rainbow. And this actually is our solar spectrum. So it's sunlight is not split up by the rainbow, but by a special instrument inside a telescope called a spectrograph. And what you can see here are all these different black lines. They're like bites taken out of the spectrum, bites taken out of the rainbow. I love this image. Each of these different lines are atoms or molecules, either in Earth's atmosphere, or actually even in our sun's atmosphere called the photosphere. And here, each one of them is different actually, and each one corresponds, each line or a set of lines corresponds to a different atom or molecule. And if you studied this subject, some people actually are experts and they know which lines belong to which atoms and molecules. So our goal is to take spectra of atmospheres far away and to identify atoms and molecules in the atmosphere. And in fact, we already do this. We already actually do observe exoplanet atmospheres. Hot giant planets, mostly. Some mini Neptunes, some cooler planets. We're not able to study objects like TOI 700D yet. So far, we can only look at really hot planets. But the future is out there. And there are probably hundreds of people working on the topic of exoplanet atmospheres today. And we're trying to dream up, we work very hard on studying exoplanet atmospheres of the hot Jupiters or mini Neptunes today, using Hubble Space Telescope primarily, but also ground-based telescopes, and the methods and the atmospheres and the details and the physics and chemistry and computer algorithms, including some machine learning, including a lot of Monte Carlo methods. It's very complex. But this field is maturing rapidly, and more people can enter the field by using open source codes that are designed for you literally almost just to plug and play, although it takes more effort to understand the physics and chemistry behind the code. So it's going to be a great future for us. So spectra are required to identify a planet as Earth-like in the future, using the large telescopes that I showed you. For example, Earth and Venus are about the same size and mass. Venus is sometimes called our sister planet. But one planet, that's Earth, of course, has life, and the other, that's Venus, is completely inhospitable to life as we know it. The surface temperature on Venus is so hot, it's hot enough to melt lead. In exoplanets, we ultimately aim to identify gases that might be produced by life, so-called biosignature gases, such as oxygen or methane or other gases. In fact, my team works on literally the search for life by way of biosignature gases. We're trying to ask the question, what gases should be produced by life on an exoplanet very different from Earth's? Well, we're asking that question, we're trying to answer it. And this image, or this artist's conception, is showing you thousands of molecules in the background. Life on Earth actually produces so many molecules, thousands and thousands of different molecules, as byproducts of their metabolism. Even us humans, we're breathing out carbon dioxide. Cows and such release methane. There's ultimately lots of gases when you walk through a pine forest, all those beautiful smells. You could think of those as biosignature gases. The mold in your fridge, or if you have a compost and it smells so bad, those are biosignature gases as well. And so this image is showing you that there are thousands of molecules, but only a set of them can make through the filters that are required, such as they have to be able to, enough of them have to be produced to accumulate in the planet's atmosphere. The planet must, let's say, cooperate in some way, in that many molecules produced by life are very fragile, and they're destroyed by the starlight, by photochemistry. And in this image here, it's showing you 3 streams. One stream, the molecules probably are not made by life anywhere. One of these streams are molecules made by life on Earth, and another are ones that we hope we can detect, although we're not sure if life on Earth makes them. So to summarize, exoplanets are planets orbiting stars other than the Sun. Our first generation search for habitable worlds is using TESS. And there's a few other ground-based telescopes that supplement TESS. We're searching for rocky planets transiting small red dwarf stars. Now, we're doing that because it's easier to find small planets transiting small stars than small planets transiting big stars, which have a much weaker signal. I spent time telling you about the TESS mission. The TESS legacy is a catalog of exoplanets, will be a catalog for exoplanets for follow-up with next generation telescopes. And I also told you about some interesting planets TESS is finding in its own right. Astronomers know how to find planets, we're good at that now, and we will spend the next generations searching for signs of life on planets by way of atmosphere biosignature gases. Now, one thing I forgot to highlight about TESS is it's relying on transiting planets, that is, planets that go in front of their star as seen from the telescope. But we astronomers, we know that these transiting planets are in fact quite rare, because the planet-star system has to be very specially aligned. But there are all kinds of planets out there. The new generation of telescopes will be able to find planets that are not transiting, and so the future is really tremendous for us in exoplanets. I just wanted to close with a couple more things. One is you can pause on this slide if you want to know more about TESS. There's a lot of resources out there for you to stay up to date with the latest discoveries. And finally, I wanted to convey to you this sentiment I have that I hope that you all might share with me. And that is that, someday we'd like to be able to go to a dark sky with our children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews or friends and relatives. And we'd like to be able to point to a star, a sun-like star, and to be able to tell them that star has a planet like Earth. That concludes my talk. And if you have any questions about exoplanets, just Google for them. You'll see there's a tremendous amount of material on the web. You can join planet hunters and find planets on your own. And the next time you're out looking at the night sky, it doesn't even have to be a dark sky filled with stars. It could be in the city, you can always see at least a few stars. I want you to go out there and think about the point that there are so many planets out there. The star you're looking at surely has a planetary system. When I do that, I love to imagine that there's a planet around there with life, looking back at our sun, a star for them, wondering the same thing. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is David J. Lockett. I'm a 2020-21 Albert Einstein Fellow sponsored by the NASA Office of STEM Engagement. Space science is for everyone. My goal is to create and use accessible resources in educational settings.
Thank you, Dr. Seeger, for talking to us about exoplanets. And, you know, when we think about planets, I grew up and you grew up in a time when we had 9 planets, and now we have 8. And I've got to say that I miss Pluto. And so I don't know about you out there, but I imagine some of you also miss Pluto as a planet. If so, leave us a comment. But for me, Pluto just has all this mystery associated with it. And if I had a vote, I would say bring Pluto back to full planet status. How about you, Jeff?
I really like your conviction on this, Diane. I think it's sort of unfair to those of us who have grown up being science enthusiasts. That 9 planets thing, that's like their 50 United States, their 9 planets. It's one of those serious finite numbers that's really burned into you. If you walked away with one thing from school, hopefully it was that there are 9 planets. So it was quite controversial to look at changing that designation. And so it's fortunate that our next speaker, our next guest is really one of the most expert people anywhere on this topic. And I first saw him speak a few years ago when I traveled to Puerto Rico to attend a science conference, and I consider him to be one of the finest science speakers I've ever seen. He has a marvelous gift to communicate the information, and the passion from this speaker just pours out. It's irresistible. And I'm talking, of course, about Dr. Alan Stern, who is the lead on the New Horizons, the spectacularly successful Pluto New Horizons mission. It really has been one of the highlights of science in recent years. So I think that's about as glowing an introduction as I could give to anyone. So how about we turn it over to you, Alan?
Thank you for inviting me here. I've heard about this event for years, and it's just crazy to be at it. So I'm going to talk to you about NASA's New Horizons mission to Pluto in the Kuiper Belt, the farthest exploration of worlds in history. And a little bit about the art of imagination, which of course CI Live is all about, because there was a lot of imagination involved in putting something like this together. And then hopefully there'll be time at the end for questions. And I'm going to start my little timer. And there's no place to put the timer, so we'll just figure it out as we go. Okay, so I thought I would start at the very beginning of this story. But it's a little risky, so bear with me. Yeah, that's me. When I was a little kid, I wanted to grow up and be a scientist. And all my parents, all I ever wanted was books on astronomy and books on dinosaurs and microscopes and telescopes and all those things. And I grew up when the space program was very young, and I just wanted to be a part of it. I didn't know how to do that. My dad was a shoe salesman and then a chemical salesman. And my mom didn't have a career, but she was an accountant. And nobody in my family had ever been in anything STEM related at all, science, engineering. It worked out. I really got to live my dream of being involved in space exploration. I've done a lot of things. It's been really interesting. I went to college 5 different times, not because I dropped out 4 times, but studied physics and aerospace engineering, studied atmospheric science, got a PhD in astrophysics, and 1 other degree in astronomy. And along the way, this has been such an interesting career. And for any of you that are thinking about careers in science, it's not just about research papers and computer modeling, and in my case, going to telescopes. I got to do some really interesting things. As Tony described, I ran the NASA science program for a few years. I've done expeditions to the South Pole. This is a picture of me back in my flying days when I flew F-18 Hornets for NASA for 5 years doing airborne astronomy missions, and I flew other types of aircraft as well. But absolutely my favorite part of my career has been space missions. And I've been involved in 29 of them now, of which my very favorite is New Horizons. And that's actually a picture of me on the right
Actually, both of those. That's New Horizons, the launch vehicle at the Cape down in Florida, just a couple days before we launched it in 2006. And that's inside the nose cone with the spacecraft above me, sitting up on that pedestal, which is a live ammo third stage for the rocket. But I thought I'd tell you the whole story of how this came to be and a little bit about what we learned in conducting this exploration. And you know, it really is an epic mission. The farthest exploration ever done, as I told you, a journey all the way across the solar system. And it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. People just like you and me got together and, as I'll describe, won the opportunity to do this project. In the 1960s and 70s and 80s, in our parents' generation of explorers, the very best, most prized missions were always the first missions to a new planet. First mission to Mars, first mission to Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, what have you. And by the time I got to graduate school, all that had been done, all the way out to Neptune. And Pluto was kind of the last train to Clarksville. It was the only opportunity in my generation to be a part of a first exploration mission. And the interesting thing about Pluto is it's not only the farthest and the last of the classically known planets, but it's a whole other type of planet, the third group of planets in our solar system. I'll say more about that. So scientifically, it was a real prize. But here's a little cartoon version of our journey when we launched in 2006 and we got to Pluto in 2015, a decade later. I'll say a lot more about that. But spoiler alert, it all worked out. The mission succeeded spectacularly. This is a picture of Pluto. I have another picture of Pluto here. This is a book that David Grinspoon and I wrote about this entire project. It came out in 2018. It's called Chasing New Horizons. They have it back there. Be happy to sign if you brought a copy or if you buy a copy. And it has a lot more of the story than I can possibly tell you in the next 35 or 40 minutes. But this is a pretty good picture of Pluto. Let me show you what it was before we went there. Oh, that's the book. We already talked about that. That's the best picture of Pluto ever made before New Horizons arrived. How's that for good? Right? You can laugh. I took this picture with the Hubble Space Telescope. And at the time this was taken, it was the very first time that Pluto had ever been seen as anything but a point of light. The Hubble is a good enough telescope that even though Pluto is 3+ billion miles away, we could actually barely resolve its surface. And we wrote scientific papers about this picture, and the ones just like it. Can't you see the northern polar cap? Isn't it obvious? Of course it's not, because even breakthrough image at its time in the late 1990s, you really can't do the exploration of planets when you have fuzzy pictures like this. You just can't see what's going on. This is the kind of image you need to do planetary science. This is a picture of the Earth. And you know, if we'd never been to the Earth and you only had this one picture, you could learn a tremendous amount. You would learn it's a water-ocean world with continents and weather, and you could learn about its weather systems and much more about this world from just a single picture. But this is the minimum kind of resolution that you need. And the problem is, the planets are far away, so we have to send spacecraft to them to get pictures like this. Let me make this point a little clearer. If you take this picture of the Earth and you degrade it in the computer, you repixelate it to the same pixelation and resolution as the image of Pluto that I just showed you with the Hubble, it's not so much. It's not so good. My postdoc Amanda Zangari did that just to illustrate the point. There's the Earth at Pluto resolution. What can you learn? Right? It drives home the point that we have to go to these places, even though it's expensive and far away and takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. We have to go there to really learn about them. What is this a picture of? Similar resolution. One guess. Who's got a guess? Mars. Excellent guess. And completely wrong. Right? Right? Same thing. I just pixelated this image of the American flag. So you can go way wrong. So we want to go to the planets. We've been doing that since the 1960s, since the earliest days of space exploration. And I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about how we got to do New Horizons. Because between the early 1960s and the late 1980s, NASA, your space agency, the space agency of the United States, was the first to every planet in the solar system, from Mercury, closest to the sun, all the way out to Neptune. almost 3 billion miles away. Every single one of those first journeys was successfully done by our country and NASA. But that was about the time I was getting out of graduate school, and there was no plans for a mission to the last of the classically known planets. And a small group of us, young scientists and engineers, thought, well, wouldn't it be dandy if we could lead something like this or be a part of something like this? And why haven't we done this exploration of Pluto? So we started an effort to do that, and we had no idea how hard it would be. It ended up taking 14 years to find the money. I can't tell you how many different mission studies. Along here, you can see lists of Pluto 350 and Mariner Mark II and Pluto Fast Flyby and others, where NASA would put some study money in and we'd try to develop a concept, and for one reason or another, it would fail. Couldn't find the money, couldn't convince the right people that were decision makers, didn't have the right design, didn't have the right cost controls and management, whatever. And each time we had to change, it was really difficult. It really took a lot of stamina and persistence to start over again and again and again. But we just kept our eyes on the prize. We knew what we wanted to do, and we just, every time we got knocked down, we'd stand right back up and we tried again and again and again. And ultimately, New Horizons resulted from that. And what really unlocked it, what really changed the landscape scientifically, what raised the priority to do this from just, this is the Everest of planetary exploration, the farthest, and a whole new region of the solar system, was the discovery in the 1990s that, although we didn't realize it when Pluto was discovered almost 100 years ago in 1930, Pluto was just the tip of the iceberg. And by the time the telescopes got good enough, and CCD at the back of those telescopes in the 90s, we started to discover that there are planets like Pluto dotting the outer solar system beyond Neptune. So Pluto wasn't an oddball, kind of a misfit that didn't fit the pattern of the inner rocky planets and then the giant planets. Pluto was the harbinger of a whole new class of planet called the dwarf planets. And these are all real objects: Quaoar, Sedna, Haumea, Makemake, Pluto, Eris, all of them. And there are now literally dozens of these known. And so when it came time to rank priorities for the 2000s, for new space missions to start, our National Academy of Sciences ranked the exploration of Pluto and this new region of the solar system out beyond Neptune called the Kuiper Belt as the #1 priority for funding, because it wasn't just about exploring this one fascinating planet anymore. It was about going to the first in a brand new class. And obviously that's more important than just an individual object. So then NASA conducted a competition. They made an announcement that teams could form industrial teams and compete to design and build and fly this mission across the solar system. By then, in 2001, we'd been working on this for a dozen years. And it was finally time to actually go and do it. And so my phone rang from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, and they had led every first mission to the planets in history. And they said, would you be in charge of our mission to Pluto? Felt pretty good about that. And then their arch competitors called from the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, and they said, would you lead our mission to Pluto? And ultimately, I chose to go with Hopkins, and this is the cover of our proposal. And for those of you who haven't been involved in something like this, which is probably most everybody, these are big documents. They're like the thickness of an old New York City phone book. Hundreds, actually over 1,000 pages of engineering design, management plans, communications plans, cost and budget, teaming arrangements, everything to show that your team is not only the most qualified, but that you have the best concept and the highest probability of carrying it out on cost and on budget. So there were 5 teams that proposed. New Horizons was one of those teams, and fortunately, we won. We won that competition. And then, it's that old saying, oh, we got what we wanted. We got what we asked for, now what do we do? Because we were in a horse race to get this built. And the reason was, by the time the competition was finished in 2001, it was necessary to build this spacecraft in record time. because in order to get to Pluto, we needed not just a very large rocket, but also a speed boost by flying by Jupiter. And let me just show you a little something. If this is the sun in the middle of the solar system, Jupiter goes around every 12 years. And Pluto goes around, it's much farther out, only every couple of hundred years. So about every 12 years, Jupiter lines up along the route to Pluto. And if you don't go when it's in the right direction, you have to wait another 12 years. So for us, we had one 3-week-long window in time in January of 2006. Launch it then or go home for a decade. So, and that was only a little over 4 years after we were selected in November of 2001 to do this. So we were really under the gun. A typical mission, like you've heard of Voyager, and maybe you've heard of the Mariners and other historic first missions, they typically would take 6 to 10 years to design and build and test it and get it ready and go. And we had 4 years and 2 months. And so I call this whole period the blur. From 2002 to 2005, the 2,500 men and women who worked on this project, myself included, it was nights and weekends, 52 weeks a year for 4 years. And it was an amazing commitment of this team. But, you know, to be a part of something like this, to be able to do not just the farthest mission, and actually to be a part of the fastest spacecraft mission ever launched, but to actually do something a little bit larger than life, something historic, to explore the Kuiper Belt for the first time, to be the first to this new class of planets, and to be the only first mission to a new planet in our entire generation, really drove people, really motivated them to work hard, to innovate, and to work our way through problems. This is the core team of us, a picture taken back in 2004. So every one of those people was a leader of some team, the launch team, the mission operations team, the engineering team, so forth and so on, myself included, for the entire mission. And this is a group of Americans who worked incredibly hard under very difficult circumstances. Besides having to do this in half the time, the budget that NASA had available was only 1/5 the budget that NASA had to do Voyager. So we had to reinvent how to do this at a completely different price point, right? Imagine if you're used to buying cars at one price, and then you were tasked with designing and building a new type of car that's 5 times cheaper. You have to completely reinvent everything about how you do it, and we did. This is a cartoon drawing of the spacecraft that we built, New Horizons. And the arrows are to the 7 scientific instruments that have those different names there. This is the dish antenna on top of the spacecraft. It's about 7 feet across. So the entire spacecraft is very small, much smaller than the stage, about the size of a baby grand piano. It only weighs about 1,000 pounds with fuel inside. And everything for the journey is inside that box. It's covered in this gold foil, which is a thermal blanket, because where we're going is very far from the sun, too far from the sun to use solar rays. The temperatures are almost absolute zero. They are literally 40 degrees above absolute zero far out there. The spacecraft is powered by a nuclear power supply. I'll show you a picture of it in a few minutes. It communicates through this dish antenna with a small transmitter, only 30 watts. And inside this box is propulsion and guidance, communication systems, thermal control, main computers, and everything is twinned. We have 2 of everything in case something breaks. So 2 main computers, 2 sets of thrusters, 2 guidance computers, 2 sets of transmitters, 2 sets of receivers, so forth and so on. Except for the structure of the spacecraft and this nuclear battery, we have 2 of everything, kind of a Noah's Ark approach. This is a picture of the spacecraft after we built it in Florida, just a couple of months before we launched it, in a clean room. And here you see a better view. First of all, that gold foil installation isn't on the main spacecraft, so you can see the aluminum structure of the spacecraft. This hair curler looking thing is not a hair curler, that's the nuclear battery. And it's fueled with plutonium, which, by the way, is an element discovered in the 1930s and named for the planet Pluto. So we actually launched plutonium to Pluto, and that's what powers the spacecraft. Now think about this. That nuclear power supply only produces about 250 watts of electricity. It's about 4 light bulbs. So everything on the spacecraft All those systems I named, communications, guidance, command and control, all the 7 scientific instruments, propulsion, all those things, they have to run on the power of 4 light bulbs. It's one of the design challenges. And you see people around it, so there's a, you get a feel for the scale of how small it is. And we intentionally designed this to be as small and compact as possible. Because if you build something very small and you put it on an extremely large rocket, the result will be the highest possible speed, which is what we wanted because we had to cross the entire solar system in record time. So a lot of the design effort was to design it to be low power and to be very compact. It was an amazing job. The engineers that worked on this really broke the mold. And you know, Voyager, how many of you have ever been to the Air and Space Museum in Washington and seen Voyager? It's hanging from a ceiling there. It's a big spacecraft by comparison. Actually, New Horizons is hanging next to it in the same display hall. And it's like a houseboat and a hamster. I mean, it's really small. And so I like to make the analogy that just like computers used to be mainframes, they were called, they filled an entire room. They cost millions of dollars. They had no power compared to your iPhone that fits in your hand, right? And costs hundreds of dollars or $1,000, right? The same way, New Horizons shrunk it all down and did it for much less money, and yet it's much more powerful than Voyager and all of its predecessors because it wasn't built with Stone Age 70s technology. It was built with 2000s era technology, modern avionics and other modern systems. This is the rocket that we launched on. It's called an Atlas V. And it is one enormous rocket. I'm curious, in this audience, how many people here have ever been to a major rocket launch, like down in Florida? Like 4 people. You gotta go do that. Like, no kidding. Because these rockets are the size of, they're bigger than any building in Des Moines. They're the size of downtown skyscrapers in Chicago. They are enormous. This rocket is 225 feet tall. These solid rocket boosters alone are 7 stories tall. There's 5 of them on this. This is the most powerful rocket that existed back then in 2006. And when I was a little kid, I used to build Estes model rockets and launch them, sometimes down the street at police cars, but usually straight up. And I have to tell you, for a kid that mowed lawns and washed cars to get more money to buy bigger and bigger rockets, you have no idea how much fun it was ordering this baby. And completely tricked out, right? Because we wanted the most performance. So every solid rocket motor, the lightweight nose cone, all the goodies, is a $180 million rocket. That payload bay, the bulbous part at the top, the nose cone, is built to fly satellites the size of moving vans. And we put little New Horizons in it on the top. It was like basically the hood ornament on the rocket was our spacecraft, right? That was the other thing. How many of you built model rockets? Ever, right? I don't know if you're like me. I could never get the sticker on straight without a crease. Look at this, NASA, perfect. Okay, so that's New Horizons inside the nose cone. That's me standing in front of it on the day that we fueled the nuclear power generator with its plutonium. And it was at that point radioactive, it was hot, and so we needed to close that door as a radiation shield. But they let a few of us take our picture with the spacecraft, and I asked to go last because I had worked on this thing since by then it was 16 years. And I thought, this will be the last picture ever taken of New Horizons. The door's going closed and you'll never see it again. So, so that was the last picture ever taken of New Horizons. I love that because we've never seen it since then. And then we launched it. That was on a Friday, actually Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th of January 2006. We launched it on Thursday, January the 19th, just 6 days later. And I thought I'd show you a video of the launch and just stop talking and let you watch the launch. Remember as you watch this that the rocket, it's not 5 or 6 feet tall like you see projected here. It's 225 feet tall. Watch it when it lifts off. It's basically a downtown skyscraper that takes off vertically. You'll see it cross a cloud deck about 10 seconds after launch. That cloud deck is 2 miles high. Think about that. Something the size of a downtown skyscraper in Chicago can boost itself to be 2 miles high in 10 seconds. In half a minute, it went supersonic. Then you'll see the solid rocket motors detach. You'll see the nose cone come off because we're already at space altitude. You can still see it in the video. Then it'll disappear behind some clouds. So let's watch the launch of New Horizons back in January of 2006.
Status check.
Go Centaur.
This is Atlas Launch Control at T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff of NASA's New Horizons spacecraft on a decade-long voyage to visit the planet Pluto and then beyond. That's 15 seconds. Everything continues to look good. As the Atlas V vehicle climbs away from Florida's east coast, the 5 solid rocket strap-on boosters are burning just fine, sending the New Horizons spacecraft on its way to the very edge of our solar system.
This is where the solid rocket motors run out of propellant and they detach. So that really lightens the vehicle so it can accelerate even faster. That's the nose cone ride. Six minutes later, it was in Earth orbit, going 18,000 miles an hour. We flew halfway around the Earth to the point that had been mathematically calculated to aim for Jupiter. And relit the engines, took ourselves out of Earth orbit, burned out the second stage, lit the third stage, and accelerated the spacecraft to become the fastest spacecraft ever launched. To give you a feel for the speed, when you read about those Apollo missions, and this conference has had Apollo astronauts many times here. Those missions flew to the moon launching at 25,000 miles an hour and took 3 days to reach the moon. And we did it in 9 hours. Okay, and we've been traveling at that speed, almost 1 million miles a day, ever since. It's 14 years now. Every day. And so it took us a decade to cross the solar system, but we weren't done. It was the fastest any spacecraft had ever traveled, and still is. That's the route of flight. We launched in January 2006, we flew by Jupiter 13 months later, and then took 8 years after that to reach our intercept with Pluto, and then out into the Kuiper Belt, this haze that's shown here like a torus around the solar system. So when we first launched from the Earth and we're on our way to Jupiter, our job in that 13 months was to check out the spacecraft, check out all of its systems, its backup systems, get it all up and running, learn to fly it, and aim for the correct aim point at Jupiter that would slingshot us to Pluto. And if you miss that aim point, you are going somewhere in a hurry, but it is not Pluto. So you better get that part right. The other thing that we used Jupiter for was a flight test, because it was the only thing that we passed along the way. So it was a chance to check out all the software and the spacecraft systems to make sure that when we got to Pluto 8 years later, that it would all work. And it did work. It all worked at Jupiter. We found a few things we learned from. We hit that aim point, and then we launched off on that 8-year journey across this giant ocean of space we call the middle solar system, from Jupiter to Pluto, 2.5 billion miles. Basically, think of this. The entire Obama administration, both of them, 8 years, this spacecraft was flying day after day, week after week, all that time to cross the outer solar system. Our flyby of Jupiter was very successful. Here we are on the cover of the Rolling Stone for Nerds, Science magazine, with images of Jupiter and one of its volcanic moons. And then we launched off on this giant journey where our little flight control team, I told you, 2,500 people worked to design and build a spacecraft. But once we launched it, all we needed was a small flight control team, the science team, and a very small engineering team. So there were only 50 people working on this project at that point. And that's part of how we kept the cost down, was that we We automated a lot of things with modern computing and made the spacecraft very autonomous so that we didn't need a big flight control team. Many less people than are in this room. And then we went all the way out to Pluto for a flyby in 2015. This is actually Glenn Fountain and Becca Sepan. Glenn is the project manager for New Horizons for many years, and Becca is one of our flight controllers. And both these pictures are taken at our little mission control, which is in Maryland, just outside Baltimore. One thing I didn't tell you about, but I want to, is that in order to make all of the images and spectra and other data types that we had to collect work out when we got to Pluto, we had to arrive very precisely after this long journey of 9.5 years. In fact, in order to know where everything, we programmed the spacecraft, and we had to tell it when it would be there and exactly where it would go through the system, so that it would know where to look to photograph Pluto and each of its moons and do all of its work, over 400 scientific observations. And so it was counting on our arriving at just the right place and time. In fact, the window in space that we had to arrive at is about the size of the county that Des Moines sits in. Now that seems pretty big, like compared to a basketball hoop, but if you're aiming from 3 billion miles away, itty itty bitty in the distance. And that was a real challenge to get the navigation right. It's basically the equivalent of hitting a golf ball on the West Coast in San Francisco and landing a hole-in-one in New York City. It has to be that accuracy. And because Pluto's moving through space at thousands of miles an hour, and each of its moons are traveling around it at the speed of a supersonic jet fighter, we had to arrive at a very specific time to know that everything would be in the right place. So after a 9.5-year journey, the specification was we had to arrive within 9 minutes of the time that we set when we launched. Yesterday, I flew from Denver to Des Moines, and United Airlines could not pull that trick off. Not even close, okay? We actually arrived at Pluto only 86 seconds off target after 9.5 years. I'm pretty proud of the fact that we arrived early, by the way. This is a kind of a family portrait taken from millions of miles away on approach of Pluto. And for reference, because you're not familiar with this, the distance from one side to the other is about the distance from Denver, Colorado, where I live, all the way to New York City. Okay, so it's about a continent-sized planet. Its biggest moon, the gray one, is called Charon. It was discovered from the Earth. And those two little moons, along with two even smaller ones, were discovered with the Hubble Space Telescope by our team while we were flying to Pluto. And this is a close-up of Pluto and the big moon, Charon. And you can see they look very different. These two planets have been living together for 4.5 billion years. They don't look anything alike. Pluto is big and colorful and lots of interesting geology. Charon's kind of dull and dark and gray. And I'm going to spend most of my time telling you about Pluto rather than the moons. This is a set of images that we took from New Horizons as we flew by, and then we put them in a computer and wrapped them on a sphere to give you the impression of what it would look like to actually be there, as if you were an astronaut flying over the surface. This entire giant feature here is the left side of Pluto's heart. It is a nitrogen glacier. It's made of the stuff you're breathing, nitrogen, but it's condensed into a snow at these cold temperatures near absolute zero. And this thing is enormous. This glacier that you see is the size of Texas and Oklahoma combined. More than 1 million square kilometers of ices. And these are mountain ranges that ring this entire basin that the glacier is in. These mountains are made of water ice. We know that because we can spectroscopically fingerprint their composition with instruments on board New Horizons. These mountains are tall. They're as tall as the Rockies where I live. Some of them are even taller. They go up to 20,000 feet tall. And you can see lots of other interesting geology. These are big tectonic canyons, probably formed by the stress of the impact that made this basin billions of years ago when something 100 miles across hit Pluto and dug this basin out. But you can also see lots of craters. I'll show you more about that and other things. So these are mountain ranges on the surface of Pluto. And the coolest thing about it to me is that they have snow caps, just like the Rockies where I live. And we've never seen that anywhere else in the solar system except at Mars. But these snow caps, they look like snow caps you're used to if you've ever been out west, but they're not the same. They're not water ice like you would see in the Rockies. They're actually made of methane, which is the natural gas that comes out of your furnace or on your stove, right? It snows fuel on Pluto. It's like a sci-fi planet. Here's a picture of some of that heavily cratered terrain that I showed you before. The little green box in the picture of Pluto up there is the context image. So the little green box is where we are on the planet, right here. And you see all these craters? In my field, in planetary science, we use this to age date the surface. And the experiment's pretty simple in principle. It's easy to understand, even though the math is intense. But if it was raining outside and you ran outside with a sheet of paper, it would start to dot. And the longer you leave it out in the rain, the more dots. And the same thing, it's raining impactors in the Kuiper Belt. It's been raining for 4 billion years. And the more craters, the older a surface is. So this one's about as chocked with craters as you can get. They're sitting on top of one another in many cases. Okay, that's called saturation cratering. And by knowing the number of objects that are out there and doing some math, you can calculate the age of this surface from just counting the craters. And Kelsey Singer on our team, who's a planetary geologist, an expert in this particular area, did this, and this surface you're looking at is as old as our solar system. It's as old as the Earth. It's 4 billion years, 4.5 billion years old. This is right next to it. See the green box? It hardly moved. On the glacier, what do you see? How many craters? How many craters do you see? None. Not one. Everywhere we look, even with better images than this projector can show you, we can't find a single crater anywhere on this surface the size of Texas and Oklahoma, which means this surface is very young. In fact, we can calculate an age for it. It's 1,000 times younger than the terrain right next to it. It's millions of years old at most. I say at most because we don't see any craters, so all we can do is set a constraint on its age. But what this means is that little planet Pluto is somehow creating terrains 4.5 billion years after it was formed. It's making things the size of Texas yesterday geologically. And how that works, nobody understands. Never before in the solar system have we ever seen the Energizer Bunny planet like Pluto that could do this. Usually small worlds cool off over time and they die, like the Earth's moon. There's no serious active geology on the Earth's moon. So Pluto should be a dead world, and yet what do we see? We see these enormous terrain fields that were created yesterday geologically. And we see more. Here, this is a terrain map where the colors correspond to altitudes, like you see in the legend. So we see mountains and then down on the glacier. And in here, you can see a giant avalanche that poured out into this basin, an area the size of Chicago. And no craters. This is in the recent past. Some titanic avalanche took place here. We see volcanoes, ice volcanoes. Again, a sci-fi world. Not lava, but ices come out of these volcanoes. And this structure is large. It's about the size of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. It's 15,000 feet high. The caldera, the hole in the middle, we can see down into it, and we have stereo imaging, so we know exactly how deep it is. It's 10,000 feet deep. The entire structure is about 100 miles across. And if you look on the flanks of this volcano, you can't find any craters there either. We think we may have found one. But again, this must have been created recently. All this activity is going on in this little world that we thought should be a dead world. Here, we see evidence for a frozen lake. The stereo images show it's in a hanging valley, just like lakes in Colorado, where I live. You see a shoreline around it. The stuff in the lake is that same stuff as in the glacier, because we spectroscopically fingerprinted. It's nitrogen again. The lake is about 30 miles long and about 20 miles across. The thing is, Pluto has a thin atmosphere. And for those of you who are physics or chemistry majors or engineering majors, you know about something in your basic chemistry and physics courses called the triple point. The triple point of nitrogen, the stuff that this is made of, doesn't allow liquids to exist on, liquid nitrogen to exist on the surface of Pluto because there's not enough atmospheric pressure to put a lid on those liquids so that they can stay. They would boil away very quickly over time. So if this is like from CSI, right? This is a clue. This tells us that if this was a lake, which it looks like, and the fact that it's in a hanging valley makes it naturally, a pooled liquid in a little basin. If this was a lake, then Pluto used to have a much thicker atmosphere in the ancient past, thicker even than Mars. We have other evidence for that too, but I want to show you this. This is cool. We took New Horizons images and we stitched them together as if you were flying over Pluto from the North Pole at the top down onto the glacier. So take an airplane ride over Pluto, down from the North Pole across these cratered badlands, caked in snow. You can see inside the craters and all kinds of interesting layering, tracks that look like tornadoes or dust devils that came across the surface. And then see the scale bar, 6 miles, the big mountain blocks that we fly up on. And then we're going to cross a shoreline onto that glacier in just a moment. Here we go, past the mountains, onto the glacier, which has these really interesting geological patterns, dune fields, all kinds of interesting geology. Turns out Pluto is, although a small world, it's as complex as the Earth or Mars. And it totally has rewritten the textbook, not just on the geophysics of how you can have activity long after formation of a small planet, but also how complex small planets are. Most of everything that we've seen in the solar system, the smaller the world, the simpler it is. Pluto is totally opposite. And so I thought I'd show you this and a couple of other things to say. Back in 2015, when we did this, we didn't have to imagine it anymore. No more fuzzy dot. This is a live picture taken of our science team when the very first image of Pluto came back to Earth. And these are people that worked on this project for 15 years. You can see the energy in the room. Total excitement. One shot. We didn't have a second spacecraft, no Voyager 2 in case it went wrong. No way to make a U-turn and come back. If that software was wrong, the navigation was wrong, the timing was wrong, the spacecraft had a fault, anything. If we got it wrong, none of this would have happened. It was very high stakes for us. In my case, I had worked on this since graduate school, and it was just amazing. And the other amazing thing was that people came out of the woodwork to be there in the public. At our mission control, thousands of people showed up. If you look in the back in the fuzz on that big screen, you see the 4 on the right, it's 4 seconds to fly by, okay? And people are just going nuts. They just came out of the woodwork. And it was everywhere. It was on the cover of the New York Times. It was on the cover of hundreds of newspapers the next morning, all across the world. And I got copies of newspapers from NASA, from Europe and from South America and from Asia, and we were just like, wow, the interest in this is unbelievable. I gave a public talk in Calgary, Canada, about a month later, and I said there were newspapers from every continent on the Earth except Antarctica. And the next morning, the editor of the only paper in Antarctica emailed me with the cover picture saying, us too. Google gave us the Google Doodle, that's New Horizons. It was all over the web, all over social media, and all over magazines. My next door neighbor emailed me during the flyby, and he said, Alan, at our house, we take 7 magazines every month. 6 have come so far. You or your mission are on every single cover. And if you're on the cover of Cosmopolitan when it comes, I'm going to jump off my roof. So I saved his life. We weren't on that. But after we flew by Pluto and sent all the data back, we went off into the Kuiper Belt, the second part of our mission. This is a very large structure. So the distance from the Earth to Pluto is 3 billion miles. The Kuiper Belt exploration we're doing is more than 1 billion miles further still. This spacecraft has been flying on since 2015. And in fact, just a year ago, in January of 2019, we had a flyby of the first ever flyby of a Kuiper Belt object. And these are very different from planets. These are the building blocks of planets. They're tiny. And if the AV guys can start this video, it runs very quick. Here's Pluto, and we're going to zoom up on the glacier, and then we're going to put a scale model of the Kuiper Belt object that we flew by. So we had to hunt this thing down. It's called Arakoth. We found it with a Hubble Space Telescope from Earth, and then we had to plot its orbit and make an intercept like you'd shoot skeet, but with a spacecraft going 35,000 miles an hour, okay? And hunt it down in the darkness of the Kuiper Belt. It's almost pitch black. right? And we're trying to find something basically the size of one mountain on Pluto, 1 billion miles further, and do an intercept that was accurate. And it turns out that worked too. This is it. This is Arrokoth, seen on January 1st, 2019, as our spacecraft zoom by. And it is a crazy looking place. There's nothing like it ever. This is a primordial 4 billion year old building block of planets like Pluto and the planets of the inner solar system too. You can see it looks like two things that are stuck together. That's called a contact binary because the objects are contacted, not orbiting each other. Very strange world. This is in true color. It's very red. Its surface is covered mostly in molecules of alcohol and water ice, not the kind of alcohol you drink, like rubbing alcohol, not literally isopropyl. And here's a set of images of it. You can see from this the 3D shape is very bizarre. It's very flat, like stones you would skip on a lake. And this is taught us by seeing something ancient that has always been cold and never disturbed, unlike any of the worlds of the inner solar system, about how these so-called planetesimals, the building blocks of planets, formed. And it's totally revolutionized our knowledge of how things formed, of how the planets got their start. And I can tell you, for those of us, I showed you that picture when we flew by Pluto. This is 4 years later in 2019. For the people who worked on this is 3 in the morning on January 1st, right after it turned 2019. And the skeet shooting was perfect. This is literally, again, at the moment of the first image coming down. And you can see people, they're more than relieved, they're excited. And for all of us that worked on this is such a team effort. All of spaceflight is a team sport. You can't do it alone. And when you work on something like this that's high stakes and you get no second shot and then it works out, it is emotionally overwhelming. And then you go back to nerding out and you get it around the computer and you find out, what do we see here? What do we find? So New Horizons has just been the ride of a lifetime for all of us, and scientifically just a blockbuster. And now we're going even farther out. The spacecraft is still traveling at this amazing speed. It's got fuel and power to run for another 20 years. And we are journeying farther into the Kuiper Belt and looking for our next flyby target. And I will end by showing you my favorite picture of the entire mission. This is a picture of Pluto, taken just after we flew past it, and we're looking back. This is true color. This is Pluto's atmosphere, which is actually blue, just like the Earth's sky, and it's backlit by the sun. So the sun is on the other side. And the only way that you can get this image is to be on the far side of Pluto, to get that to all line up. When you work on something like this for 26 years, from when it's in your imagination, and you want it, and you work on it, and you get knocked down, and you get up, and you try again, and then you get knocked down, and you try again, and then you compete in a David and Goliath battle, and David wins, and you get to actually do it, and then you have to build it in record time and for record low cost, and yet you pull it off as a team, and then the launch works, and then it flies all the way across the solar system, and nothing breaks, and the flybys work out perfectly, and the science is mouthwatering. For me, this is like the Apollo images of the Earth rising over the moon. The we did it. Because the only way to get this picture is to be on the far side of Pluto. And our team really did that. And we're so proud of it, and we're so thankful that we live in a country that can do these great things and that can go down in history for being a country that actually cares about science and engineering and about contributing to the world in a positive way. Thank you very much.
My name is Dr. Tanya Harrison, and I am a professional Martian and the manager of science programs at the federal arm of Planet Labs. Space exploration is important to me because it helps us put Earth and humanity in context in our solar system and in the universe. The Earth is unlike any other planet we've ever seen in the universe so far, and it's the only one we found with life. And it's really important for us to understand why that's the case. What is it about Earth that made it the anomaly in our solar system, maybe in our galaxy, or maybe even in the universe? We know that other planets in our solar system had the conditions that could have supported life in the past, most specifically Mars, but possibly also Venus, and maybe some of the moons in the outer solar system have environments that would be conducive to life as we know it. But we haven't found anything yet. So that's kind of an important question for us to answer. If there is no life anywhere else, why? What made Earth so special? And if there was life somewhere else and that life died out, again, why? I really want to know the answers to these questions, and I really hope we answer them in my lifetime.